Chapter 22:16. Published at 9th of October 2023 2:04 and 17 seconds p.m. Chapter 22:16, maybe. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 22:16 maybe. The reaction that Elryan might have expected wasn't the one he received. If anything, he was underwhelmed. Lionel had already seen just how far apart the strengths of various races could be. Setting aside the spirituals, there was himself. When that figure in the blood pool moved, it had to be understood that Lionel's dimension didn't change. The only thing that changed was how much access to his own personal talent he had. That meant, the man who could kill ancestors, and even overlords, as though they were wet tissue paper, had been the very same sixth-dimensional Lionel. Of course, that was still not as impressive as Elryan, who was only in the fifth dimension. Though the latter had said quasi-sixth-dimensional, this was the reality. Quasi or not, it was still the fifth dimension. However, it wasn't enough to completely upend Lionel's reality. As for why he was underwhelmed, it was because he would expect such an existence to be further along at 14 years old. If he had been born in the Morales family, he would have most definitely been faster than that. He had entered the dimensional verse at 18 years old. He was now 26 years old, and most of that time had been spent struggling on his own. It was completely unlike Elryan, who even had access to such a treasure. That said, Lionel still stored away several things from this information, much of which was speculation. Elryan had said if his age was converted, it was very possible that he had experienced much more than 14 years, but just like dog years, different species experience the years differently. This would explain why there wasn't even a hint of childishness on his face, though that could also be explained by his race itself. The second important speculation was that he didn't believe that Elryan was actually just slow to progress. Or, rather, even if he was slow, every step he took was far more substantial than Lionel's own. That meant that the Pluto race had a different method of progression, one that Lionel was very much interested in. A part of his senses drifted down to the members of the Void race that Shanrei had left behind, a cold glint lighting his eyes. Elryan shook his head. It seemed that this kind of man couldn't be swayed in such a way. He didn't know why he had wasted his time. It was truly uncharacteristic of him. There also wasn't a point in converting his strength and age like that. This man would have no reference for what that truly meant. Seeing that Lionel seemed to have some intention toward the other Void race members, he was rendered somewhat speechless. Laying a hand even on a servant of a god race would get your entire race eradicated. He had yet to get to it because Lionel didn't seem to be paying attention, but if Lionel had truly killed Shanrei, it would have been like sentencing everyone to death. He didn't know why, but he didn't want to see this man die, at least not in such a ridiculous and unfair way. He truly wouldn't even see his enemies if he made such a folly. He would likely spend his years in eternal damnation, never laying eyes on the person who put him there in the first place. At that moment, Elryan suddenly remembered something his father had told him. He was used to being reprimanded for his straightforward ways. He might be talented, but he lacked in charisma. As a leader, this was a deathly sort of flaw. His father had once said that smart people couldn't be convinced with reason. Usually, they had already thought of every possibility. Telling them facts would do nothing to change the situation. He had already assumed that giving a person the facts was only right. Any logical person would obviously come to the same conclusion as him, right? But his father had said no. Humans were emotional creatures, no matter how smart they were. If you wanted to convince someone of something, you had to understand their why and manipulate that. Unless you could understand that, it would all be useless. Even if a person was stupid, so long as they had enough bias, even if you laid out all the facts before them, they might nod to your face then return to their ingrained beliefs later. But what was Lionel's why? Elryan's gaze flickered and he remembered that the world spirit had responded to Lionel. The only way that would happen would be if. Don't. Lionel suddenly said, raising up a hand. Uvalb 1 and Elryan froze, not quite understanding. I don't care how powerful your people are. I also don't care what your original purpose here was, or how you might be related to my grandfather or the Fox family. I truly do not give a damn. I can see it in your eyes. You're looking, trying to find a light of reason, trying to understand me, trying to convince me. I originally didn't know why you were deviating so far from your original personality, but now that you've told me your age, it's too obvious. You're still a child and still don't have any sort of real conviction. Elryan frowned for the first time. I wasn't even trying, but I was already leading you by the nose. What do you think I am? A broken vase you need to put back together? Maybe because your family gave you a mission to fulfill that promise you want to complete it to 100% of your ability and maybe pull me out of an abyss to help the descendants of your benefactor? Is that it? It's all worthless. You may have all of the facts, but those facts are just your understanding of your race. Do you even know who I am? Do you know what I'm capable of? Did you check to see who you were speaking to first? Or was it that because I'm a human and in your eyes, you believed that you could understand me in just a few seconds of thought? Lionel rose into the air until his nose practically touched Elryan's, looking into those eyes that held the weight of the universe within. Since you're being so helpful with your words, I'll ask you a question. Do you have any idea how close to death you were just now? That cold shiver Elryan thought had vanished appeared again. You might not believe me, but I'll lay it out for you. You see that beast corpse over there? Elryan subconsciously looked toward the void beast corpse ship. I have a beast companion that's been by my side for almost a decade. He's an adorable little mink, his fur is quite soft, and his soul would be very useful to me. If I killed him, animated him, and then used this beast corpse to breathe life into him again, making him my puppet for life, how powerful do you think he would be? Would your little prepubescent body be able to handle it? Would Shanrei be able to handle it? I have a feeling that even her entity wouldn't be able to handle it. The more Lionel spoke, the colder his gaze became, and the worse the shiver up Elryan's spine became. Do you know why you're still standing here, alive? This time, it was Elryan's turn to remain silent. Lionel turned and walked away. Maybe it's because I'm not angry enough yet. Chapter 22:17. Published at 9th of October 2023 2:04 and 15 seconds p.m. Chapter 22:17. Sturdy? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 22:17. Sturdy? Elryan found that his heart was beating too rapidly for him to control. Lionel had already gone off far into the distance by the time he regained his bearings. He didn't seem to snap out of it until he realized that Lionel was actually going down below to the location of the partially built pyramids. Elryan took another deep breath, trying to settle himself. He looked toward the corpse of the void beast. Controlling that? Wasn't that too ridiculous? Who was he trying to fool? Who would believe that a human could take control of a void beast's corpse? He had some understanding of the Fox family's ability. Of course, he knew that Lionel wasn't talking about taking control of the corpse. He was speaking of using Arise on little Blackstar and then using Assimilate and Breathe on him. That way, Blackstar would gain the strength of the dead void beast. If such a thing succeeded, Blackstar would indeed become an existence the likes of which even the entity feared, and he would indeed become a puppet of Lionel. But how could such a thing be possible? Killing little Blackstar and animating his soul was easy enough. Lionel could easily use Arise on the ancestors of the dimensional verse, so Blackstar was well within his abilities. However, while Assimilate and Breathe worked better the material was, the energy couldn't come from nowhere. It would obviously need Lionel to provide the catalyst for the fusion. If it was too far beyond Lionel's abilities, how could he possibly succeed? Elryan was smart enough to think of all of this. If the Fox family didn't have such limitation, it would be they who were the gods and not the other way around. In Elryan's opinion, the so-called ninth dimensional lineage factor was barely passable. Of course, that didn't assume that there were 10th dimensional lineage factors and above, rather it was that the title of ninth dimensional was just a world, and the ones that Lionel knew of were just the outskirts of this world. In fact, Elryan didn't call lineage factors by such titles. He divided them into complete and incomplete. Only when you were ninth dimensional could you barely be considered complete. Elryan knew all of this. So why was it that he still felt that Lionel wasn't lying to him just to save face? Was it truly because he was too young and easily led by the nose? Or was it because there were other matters that Lionel couldn't be bothered to explain? If Elryan had known Lionel, he would understand just how rare it was for Lionel care to explain anything in the first place. The idea that he would explain everything, especially to a potential enemy. Well, wasn't that too ridiculous? After one final breath, Elryan exhaled another breath and managed to fully reclaim his calm. He descended after Lionel, wanting to understand what this man was doing. Regardless of the circumstances, he had entered a state of complete curiosity. Someone else might have already been completely enraged, but Elryan was someone who had taken the humiliation at the hands of the entity as though nothing at all had happened, so how could he take a few words from Lionel seriously? Lionel landed on the ground, gliding across the grown sandy plains. The world spirit that had been fused with him had long since separated, but now it followed over his shoulder, an amorphous blob of energy. NOVLB/1N somewhere inside, Lionel wondered if this world spirit had followed his mother because it had truly chosen her, or if it was his fault. After he left this place, he couldn't very well take the world spirit with him, so it would be stuck here until Alienor was born. Who knew, maybe it attached itself to her because it had finally sensed an aura similar enough to Lionel's. Though he thought this, Lionel didn't accept it right away. For one, world spirits weren't foolish creatures, they had enough intelligence of their own though it didn't manifest in the same ways. Secondly, he felt that this current world spirit was very different from the one he knew, it was too strong. Lionel had noted this the moment it appeared, but since he was in the midst of battle, he couldn't exactly explore this idea. But now, he felt that he had quite a bit of time on his hands. Because he had been forcibly expelled from Elryan's body, for all intents and purposes, they had already failed this zone. This was unfortunate because his mother wouldn't be able to gain the benefits of completely understanding a new magic system this time. But it was fortunate in that he didn't have the same restraints. At the same time, although the rewards would be lost to them, there would be other rewards here. There were still the Void race members above and there was still this pyramid being built here. How much had Lionel gained just from entering the zone of the mere dwarven race? It benefited his combat prowess even now, and it was a large part of the reason he had mastered his spear so quickly. The benefits waiting here for him were on a completely different level. As for why the Void race members above had yet to run for their lives, the truth was that they didn't dare to. Only the likes of Lionel would dare to even speak so brazenly to a Pluto. As for them, the moment Shanrei escaped, even though Elryan had yet to speak even a single word to them, they acted as though they were captives. Lionel waved his arm and his injured elbow snapped back into place. With a clench of his fist, it was soon as though nothing at all had happened. When he entered the range of the pyramid, his eyes narrowed. With the evolution of his lineage factor, he had gained a great deal. One such thing was that his earth force affinity had risen to an entirely new level. So, when he stepped foot into range, he felt as though he was standing upon the sturdiest earth he ever had. It was a completely contradictory feeling. What about sand could possibly be sturdy? Chapter 22:18. Published at 9th of October 2023 2:04 and 12 seconds p.m. Chapter 22:18. Incomplete world. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 22:18. Incomplete world. It reminded Lionel of Elther's chaotic particle force. It was formed of granules of Earth as well, and yet it was the number one Earth force in all of existence. Well, he wasn't sure if he could say that anymore. He wondered if these force evaluations were just limited to the dimensional verse's understanding of them or not. Although he reacted as though it was nothing much, that didn't mean that he didn't take note of the existence of the Pluto and Void races. Their existence clearly meant that this world was much larger than he knew. There was a second pressure Lionel had felt just now as well, though, and that was the pressure of the others of the Pluto race. They were dressed simply, but even the shortest was at least 5 meters tall. It seemed to be reminding Lionel of Elryan's age again and again. They didn't seem powerful outside of their size, and yet their every moment seemed to rock the earth. Novelbean. As Lionel walked forward, he felt that Elryan was holding back a great deal. At the very least, when a Pluto sweat, it seemed that the entire world worked as well. Every drop of a Pluto's body was precious and couldn't be shed without an equivalent exchange. A powerful race, indeed. Lionel thought to himself. Even so, it didn't stop his steps forward. He didn't even react when Elryan appeared by his side. He really didn't understand this boy. But, he had learned that different cultures of humans could react to things differently. The Morales were a prime example. They were almost all fiery and battle-hungry, but that wasn't entirely because of their blood, it was also because of their culture. It was clear that the Pluto race had its own unique culture. They felt that they were so above everything that they weren't quick to any emotion at all. Even though Lionel had appeared, they had ignored him. Only when Elryan appeared did they look over, but even after this, they looked away. It isn't appropriate to call them servants, they don't seem to be despite their style of dress. They're artisans, and those are most definitely not limestone like the history textbooks say. As for what they're resonating with, it seems to be quartz. Quartz, back in this era, or rather a few hundred years later, would be quite widely used. It was one of the most abundant substances on Earth, and it was useful in a wide range of applications from glassware to powering watches. It was completely unremarkable, at least at the time. In Lionel's era, though, the importance of quartz skyrocketed, and it was likely also part of the reason that Earth hadn't reached the point of having to gather energy from the stars either. On Earth, by the time Lionel was born, they were able to build surface cities around quartz deposits, using the existence of these quartz deposits to power the cities entirely without the need for fossil fuels or other types of renewable energy. The best part was that this energy seemed endless and inexhaustible because it relied on the natural chemical bonds of quartz, bonds that were incredibly difficult to break as it was the fourth strongest material on Earth at the time. Quartz was quite fascinating, at least to a third-dimensional Lionel. The current Lionel had already long since stopped caring about this level of material, and had already come across a countless number that had similar and even stronger effects. Compared to third-dimensional electrochemical effects of the like, just how far beyond was a trickle of force from a fourth-dimensional ore? It could completely crush the former. But then why? Why were the artisans of this mighty race relying so heavily on this material? Lionel could tell after a few moments what was happening. They were using the pyramids as a foundation to resonate with the quartz of Earth. This would thus execute some unknown action still elusive to him, but wasn't there a better way? The obvious answer to this question seemed to be that they were on Earth, so they were just using what was available on Earth, but something was telling Lionel that things weren't as simple as they seemed. He was missing something. He would have to get closer. Just as he was going to, Elryan suddenly spoke. This pyramid is one of the symbols of our Pluto race. It's being used to harness the energy of your planet. It will ultimately downgrade its level, an unfortunate price to pay. Lionel's gaze narrowed, and he looked up and toward Elryan. In the past, a member of the Fox family did a member of our Pluto race a favor. It has been many generations since then, but the favor was cashed in upon the destruction of the Fox family. This place is what you call an incomplete world. You see how all the planets and stars are scattered? This is what happens when a world fails in its birth. What you call stars are not technically real stars, they're kernels of a universe's energy. You would normally not be able to see them as they would all be fused into the land. The fact you can see them so clearly is evidence of this world being incomplete. A complete world has one land, one star, one being. An incomplete world does not, and phenomena like subdimensional zones appear as a result. Though. Elryan trailed off as though not wanting to explain the rest of this matter fully. Lionel's brows furrowed. Why was this man explaining this to him? He suddenly found himself getting annoyed. He knew that his temper wasn't the best in recent days, but this was ridiculous even for him. It was then that he calmed down. He understood that maybe the rest of the Pluto race was quite calm, but Elryan was still a child. How could he be as unbothered as he seemed? It seemed he had begun to understand more about Lionel. A person that Lionel had just reprimanded explaining things to him that he didn't understand? Was there even a better way to annoy him? Usually, incomplete worlds are disseminated to the gods as they're still valuable commodities. But this time, my Pluto race commandeered them to return this favor and help in something they called the Dream Project. The parameters of this Dream Project, though, are quite strict. The last remnants of the Fox family need safe passage, and the only way to allow that is to weaken this world. But should everything go well, this world may rise again. Lionel's gaze turned frighteningly cold. What did he just say? Author's note: sorry everyone, I've been feeling like shit all day and tried to ride it out, which is part of the reason GAB chapters were so late today, though many of you DD readers probably didn't notice that. I'll spare you the more gory details as this is a family-friendly server. Only managed to write 2 today. The good news is that I almost just wrote 1, yay? Tears. Chapter 22:19. Published at 9th of October 2023 2:04 and 10 seconds p.m. Chapter 22:19. 1 or 2 if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 22:19. 1 or 2, The Dream Project. This was only the second time he was hearing about it, but there was something that he had already deduced about it, and that was that the so-called simulation and this dream project should be one and the same. But, even beyond that, the man who had tried to strike down his father, the very man who was felled by just a single strike, a man who called himself king, should be one of the masterminds behind this dream project. Just the name alone, and the fact the Demoness had such strong dream force affinity, made Lionel feel as though it was almost a near certainty that the Three-Finger Cult was intertwined and related to all of this. How else could an organization of a so-called incomplete world like this one possibly open up a path to a complete world? The deductions seemed to logically follow from one another, flowing freely and easily. The simulation was created to help the complete world with some troubles it was having. His father became an uncontrollable variable that the complete world felt that it had to get rid of, and maybe his grandfather had fallen into that category as well, leading to the both of them being killed. Ultimately, the purpose of this dream project would become clear and obvious in the end, but if Lionel had to guess, it was likely related to demons and their invasion. N/Uvulb 1 and the so-called complete world, or the land that he had called the Cataclysm Zone up until this point, had a very clear and obvious demon problem. Their complete world was actually divided into segments as though it was in the middle of fusing with another complete world, a demon world at that. This was why their cities and the demons seemed to overlap so considerably. Of course, this was all speculation on Lionel's part, using bits and clues that he had learned of this while stuck in the Cataclysm Zone, or rather the complete world. But he had no idea just how close to the truth he was, nor did he know that the final seal blocking the demon world had been undone upon his return to the dimensional verse, causing the paused fusion to continue once more. What made this matter set with him even more obviously was how cheap the Dream Force type items were in the exchange. It seemed that someone with great Dream Force affinity was trying to make certain that they could help out as much as they could, and that was why Lionel was able to trade for so many Dream Force items that had helped him considerably until this point, items like the Dream Star Gathering Beast Formation, or the Focus Crystals, or the Perfection Stone. The purpose of this incomplete world, or rather these series of incomplete worlds, was obviously an extension of that. To build up an army of soldiers that would live in accelerated time frames and be able to create all sorts of new methods to control and manipulate force, methods that the complete world would absorb and use to strengthen themselves as well. It all made perfect sense, until Elryan mentioned the Fox family. The last remnants of the Fox? That was obviously his grandfather. But if his grandfather was the reason this simulation could even exist, then how was he related to the Dream Project? Didn't that mean that it was him and not King who was the true arbitrator? But if his grandfather was in control of all of this, why did his father have to die? Why didn't he have more control over the situation? Why didn't he save him? The more questions Lionel had, the more agitated he became, and the more than crimson light flickered in his eyes. Did he have the best impression of his grandfather? Not particularly, but the reason for why was because of his choice to massacre so many for what was ultimately just convenience. But was it still fine for him to hold this against his grandfather? He had already killed far more than the number of citizens of Earth that had died during the metamorphosis. And quite frankly, he couldn't be bothered to care even now that he had done so. Was it moral of him? Probably not. Did he find those people to be innocent? Also probably not. Who else would benefit from the conquering of the human domain if not them? And now many humans would have died to allow them such comfort. Of course, Lionel wasn't saying that this justified his actions. Quite frankly, he couldn't be bothered to justify them, he didn't care to. They had enraged him, so they suffered the price. He didn't think any other justification was needed. But by the same token, he could no longer blame his grandfather for the same things. Though, he still felt that killing your own for such a reason was far too ridiculous. Now, though, he had another reason to not let go of that anger. Just what was the truth here? He found that despite how enraged he was, he couldn't quite blame his grandfather as much as he thought he might. It was all too obvious that there were certain matters tying Emperor Fox's hands, and the fact that the four great families were seemingly trying to interfere and ruin things for him spoke volumes on their own. But that didn't mean he didn't have questions. You've probably already guessed the purpose of this world, and that's to both create warriors and gather resources. Incomplete worlds are less desirable as places to live in, but they're great commodities. Many gods even use them as a form of currency. The saying goes that existence doesn't make mistakes, even the birth of incomplete worlds can serve their own purposes. Because of their unique structure, the zones can appear, and they can reshuffle reality, allowing yet unknown theories and conclusions to be drawn. Some of the most powerful existences in all of reality use incomplete worlds as computers, as you might call them, calculating the best ways to improve their strength. 1 or 2 incomplete worlds might be born every decade or so. The others are enraged because my Pluto family allocated 100 or so to repaying this favor. Chapter 2220. Published at 9th of October 2023 2:04 and 6 seconds p.m. Chapter 2220, Crack. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again n/o/v-el/b in Chapter 2220 Crack. Lionel remained silent. His calm had returned, he simply let Elryan speak. He didn't interject, he simply let the Pluto, who he was starting to see more and more like a little boy, speak. While incomplete worlds are very useful, for many more ways than I listed as well, they're very finicky and difficult to properly control unless you have very specific methods. The Void Race, for example, are able to fuse with incomplete worlds. It's the source of the cosmos that covers their bodies. However, without their bloodline, doing something like that is impossible. This is all to say that entering an incomplete world as an existence of a complete world is not easy. Not only are there heavy restrictions on dimensional level, but there are also restrictions on how much you are allowed to affect the world. The descendant of the Fox family needed to enter, but he was much too powerful, especially since he had set his sights on Earth in particular. We're building this pyramid and a few other structures to absorb the latent potential and weaken it further. Though, it wasn't entirely for this reason either. Elryan moved on without explaining. He seemed to take some satisfaction in being able to give Lionel some of the information he wanted, but to also dangle the rest in a place that was impossible to reach. Very childlike, indeed. Lionel was almost in a mood to say that it was adorable. Though, it was hard to say such a thing about a 4-meter-tall behemoth. To make a long story short, the Fox family descendant needed our help to be able to not only enter this world but truly become a part of it. That takes quite a process, but it's not a complete loss. This incomplete world is quite interesting, and it happened to have a material I've never quite seen before. This quartz is very interesting. It seems to emit a substantial enough amount of power whenever pressure is applied to it. No other or quite works exactly like it. Lionel's gaze narrowed. He had already realized that they were working with quartz, but why would these existences find it to be so interesting? He had already said that there were similar enough materials at higher dimensions that worked a bit like quartz did, so he didn't believe that Elryan had never seen anything like this before. Though Lionel didn't seem to be paying attention, he was entirely focused on Elryan's words. His pride wasn't overblown to the point of ignoring an easy well of information right before him, even if he didn't ask any questions of his own. That's right, it seemed that he was still missing something, and then it clicked. The ores that he was thinking of that were similar enough to quartz had a very clear defining difference. Their energy was stored, while the energy of quartz was innate to its very chemical structure. For example, a force crystal would have a large well of force within, but it could be easily used up. But not quite in the same sense. The energy of quartz doesn't run out. The energy of quartz is an innate property of its chemical structure. Although it can be taken too far, it couldn't be depleted in the same sense. Lionel had never really made the distinction. To him, wasn't the energy within a force crystal part of its chemical structure? This was a difference he had never thought about. His eyes flashed with a blinding light. Of course not. What a stupid mistake. A force crystal was just a vessel capable of holding force. He had assumed that because they could be purified into pure force crystals, that they were all of one entity, one existence, but this wasn't correct. If he changed the way he viewed this, then Lionel entered a hint of a daze. Were the chemical structures of materials and the force they produced separate? His finger twitched, and he almost subconsciously called out Little Tolly, but then he realized that because he had taken the little metal spirit in as the fourth entry, it had probably fused with the body of an unknown existence by now. Even so, that didn't stop Lionel's thoughts from running faster and faster. Foundation-type ores, vein-type ores, domain-type ores, if what distinguished them wasn't their force, but rather how their chemical structures interacted with force, this would be a huge matter. It would fundamentally change how he approached the life grade and the things that he could create. He wouldn't be limited by force any longer, or more accurately, not to the same extent. The wind whipped around Lionel, and he suddenly felt that his divine armors weren't nearly ambitious enough once again. His enlightened self had no way of knowing how long it would take him to figure this out, so he had made them to the limit of Lionel's understanding, but this changed everything. His mind flashed to the gears that made up his father's dictionary. The way they moved in relation to one another, like a single thought and existence capable of reacting to every order of variable that it should ever meet. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it resembled the complex lattice structure of a chemical bond, building atop of one another. Then he thought back to the token that had allowed him to enter the dimensional cleanse trial zone. Back then, he had to rearrange what almost amounted to the chemical structure of the token, piecing it together and sliding them into their proper position, all so that he could open the portal. Wasn't it just like this too? In that case. Lionel stretched out a hand, and the earth rumbled. Deep underground, a vibrant piece of quartz broke off and tore through the layers of the ground before snapping into his palm. His eyes glowed a fiery violet and then crack. Lionel vanished, his eyes glazing over. When he appeared again, his heart skipped a beat. This starry road, that blazing blue star in the distance. He had entered the dimensional cleanse trial zone once more. Chapter 22-21. Published at 9th of October 2023 2:04 and 2 seconds p.m. Chapter 22-21. Who? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 22-21. Who? Lionel's hands squeezed down, and the quartz in his fingers shattered. The only thing he had done was dig into his memories and replicate the chemical structure of the token of entry, and he had actually been let in just like that. It seemed that he was correct. His crafting ability had taken another enormous leap forward. He had already felt that he was no worse than the life-grade ancestors of this incomplete world, but now he felt that he had definitely surpassed them firmly. In fact, they probably couldn't be said to even be in the same class any longer. And yet, he felt that he had only just entered the threshold of his father's level. In fact, saying so might be overestimating himself far too much. Lionel closed his eyes and subconsciously took out the dictionary. He hadn't been able to bring himself to even look at it in recent days, but for some reason it now gave him a great deal of comfort. Whereas in the past it was like a reminder that his father was out there somewhere and couldn't be by his side, now that he understood more of how it worked, he felt far more at ease with it in his palm. When he opened his eyes again, they were sharp, and the dictionary had vanished. "Since you're here, why don't you say anything?" A laughter rang out, but Lionel couldn't help but frown. This laughter sounded too familiar. Others might find it charismatic, but he knew a fake laughter when he heard it. It was probably the same fake laugh he had been using ever since he was old enough to know that he should probably learn to socialize properly. The cadence, the tone, the hidden hint of disdain, all impossibly subtle and yet one that he was intimately familiar with all the same. Why was there a recording of his laughter here? N//L/B/I/N I really am an arrogant prick. Lionel's gaze flickered. It was richer, a bit deeper, a bit more wizened, but he was certain as well. That was definitely his voice. He would easily remember the voice of a person he had met just a single time, let alone his very own voice. It was impossible that he wouldn't recognize it. I don't seem to like to follow rules either, it seems. You know, you're supposed to wait until all of the roads can be filled before you enter this trial world. Wouldn't it be too unfair if you can just walk through unchallenged now? Lionel still didn't respond. For some reason, he found his own voice incredibly annoying. He had already concluded that this person was trying to mess with him. It would probably be trivial for an existence that could create dimensional cleanse to change their voice. When I'm speaking, you listen. The voice became a biting cold, and a piercing pain threatened to run right through Lionel's chest. He coughed up a mouthful of blood, falling to a knee, his eyes bulging. Man, the voice became light and cheery again. Is this considered masochism? Well, I've done far worse to my body in these years. This is probably the least of them. It probably wouldn't even deserve to be ranked last. Lionel clenched his chest, the pain only slowly fading. It felt as though it had been done on purpose. This is the only real way I can communicate with my younger self. Jokes aside, I already expected myself to figure out how to enter this place alone. If I can't do it, then probably no one but my old man could. You probably won't believe it, we're stubborn like that, and ironically quite foolish, especially now. You'll probably do many stupid things between now and the moment you snap out of it. Going through a teenage angst at 26 is a bit embarrassing, don't you think? The only stain on my record, honestly. Unfortunately, everyone else is too weak. Maybe if I suffered a loss or two, it would have happened sooner, but I can't blame the world for being too incompetent. Lionel was frowning. This arrogant prick was far too annoying. He remembered the first time he had learned about dimensional cleanse. The introduction practically made him roll his eyes. In fact, he had called this bastard narcissistic back then. Those were his exact words. It seemed that he was even worse in person. I haven't appeared to give you a boon or anything. In my opinion, it would be better if you fall flat on your face soon, maybe even die a few times. I'm really only here to tell you two things. First, because of your stubbornness, Tolliver entered this world and is currently fused with the last barrier of this trial world. I originally built this in to stop most others aside from myself from reaching the final leg, but in usual fashion you've gone and screwed it up for yourself. Since you're smart, you figure out a way to separate them unless you want to kill your own metal spirit. Or don't, I don't really care. I'm sure your father would be proud. Lionel's gaze went red. One of the very first lessons he had learned from his father's dictionary was that metal spirits were partners, not tools. But that didn't mean that this person could just casually mention his father like that. However, the moment his gaze went red, that suffocating pressure descended again, and he coughed up another mouthful of blood, almost passing out entirely. Second, you had better take this seriously. Despite what I've said, you think about why I would still make this world to help a far lesser version of myself out. After this, the voice completely vanished along with the pressure. His meaning was quite obvious. This was a world filled with vital star force. Though Lionel used it offensively, it was also the reason for his exceptional stamina, aside from his lineage factor, of course. What else could this world be used for if not helping increase Lionel's chances of saving someone? If his future self had already admitted that saving his father was impossible, then who was he intending to save with all of this effort? Chapter 22-22. Published at 10th of October 2023 1:26 and 18 seconds p.m. Chapter 22:22 If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 22:22 Control. Even after the voice had long since vanished, the pain in Lionel's chest dulled just as slowly as before. It felt that he was still somewhere in the background, hiding and slowly turning down his pain as though there was some sort of hidden dial that he could tweak up or down. It was extremely frustrating, but there was something about being on your knees and being entirely unable to fight back that left one without the same room to grow angry. It was almost as though he had been forced into submission. One part of his body was billowing with rage, and the other part, the part that was still fueled with that pain that was dulling far too slowly, was bearing down like a wet blanket, suffocating his flame. Lionel was so infuriated that he roared, but as though it had sensed it, the pain heightened and what should have been a mighty roar capable of causing a mountain to collapse and a planet to quake came out instead like a muffled whimper. This time, the redness in Lionel's eyes came out far different than the past. Tears threatened to spill over, the frustration blowing over to the point he felt like throwing a fit as though he was nothing more than a child. The only thing that stopped them from falling was his pride. That sort of sickening voice in the back of his head that told him that that man might still be watching, and even if he wasn't, he was Lionel Morales. He didn't know where such thoughts came from. He didn't think himself to have such strong emotions about crying in the past. He never really thought about it, the same way he hadn't really thought about what it meant to kneel. He had definitely cried in the past, but it wasn't something that lingered on his mind, making him feel as though he was less of a man. But now it did feel that way, though maybe not for the reasons it seemed to be. Rather, it felt like he would be acknowledging something. Those tears that had fallen when he knew his father had died had dried up as quickly as they had formed. They didn't get the chance to sit and stew, to stir his soul and vent out all the frustration that wanted to rush out from his heart like a swimming tide. The whimpers that came out in place of his roar were like a rope pulling taut, stringing his throat into a tight tube that caused his neck to spasm. His heaving breaths couldn't seem to bring enough air, and his muscles seemed to have forgotten how to move. A stinging sensation in his eyes grew fiercer and fiercer until they spilled over. The weakness overcame him, his body collapsing onto the starry roads. Nothing about them seemed to be beautiful any longer. When he had first entered this world, it had felt to him that he had been entering a fairy tale, but now it felt like any normal road. And how would one feel when their face had been pressed into the ground? Maybe if it was by a boot, one would feel rage or fury. But what if it was by one's own weakness? Somewhere inside, Lionel knew that that man had definitely vanished. He knew that such a man couldn't be bothered to stay in a single place for even one moment longer than he had to. He wouldn't feel the need to pull such petty tricks either, especially with how arrogant he was. But that only made it worse. He wasn't being pressed down by anything. He even knew that that pain in his chest wasn't even the doing of that man any longer. That was just a darkness sitting in the pit of his chest, overwhelming and latching out like the venomous sting of a cobra. It wasn't a physical pain, but that only made it worse. Lionel's lip trembled, his fingers digging into the road that removed to move for him. His nails fissured and cracked, a dripping, dense blood that almost shaded black coming out. He clawed with everything he had, almost as though he could pull it back, to bundle it back up, to stuff it on the inside like he was always able to. He was Lionel Morales. His emotions had always been F.A. Section A, right? He had always been able to compartmentalize with great ease, right? He could easily flip his emotions off with a flip of a switch, right? So why was that ache getting worse? Why was it overflowing? Why was it getting stronger? Lionel tried to roar again. It was his final attempt, the last bit of strength he had left to push it away, to wrench his control back. But it once again didn't come out properly. It wasn't a roar, it was a wail. It echoed into the emptiness, reverberating into the illuminated darkness like a broken record. Lionel's stomach lurched, his body curling into a heaving motion as though he was trying to get something disgusting out of his mouth. He retched, but his stomach had nothing to give. He couldn't remember the last time he had eaten anything. He didn't need to eat. He was a machine. His force was enough, it could sustain him. He retched again, saliva and a croak coming from his mouth. The feeling of disgust welled up even stronger than before, but this seemed to be the straw that broke the camel's back. The tears poured out like a flood, blood vessels in his eyes popping in a vain attempt to stop them. And soon after, the wails echoed once again. He gripped his chest, his bloodied fingers sinking into his skin. His forehead scraped along the ground, his own broken voice reverberating back to him to the point even his ears began to bleed. But in a way, the pain was a relief. A relief from the grief that washed over him, his tears falling in an endless stream. There was no one to hear it, no one to witness it. He simply curled up in his own self-pity, his body too broken to control itself any longer. Chapter 22-23. Published at 10th of October 2023 1:26 and 18 seconds p.m. Chapter 22-23. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 22-23. Don't talk. Big Lionel lay on the starry road. He was a person very much used to being on top of everything. For the past several years, his mind had worked on such a high level that he could even tell how much time had passed without even being consciously aware of it. It was like there was a ticking clock in the back of his mind, constantly rolling forward with the seconds. After he had woken up from his coma just this past month, he had been aware of exactly how much time had passed without even having to double-check with anyone. But this time, he had no idea. He didn't know whether it had been a few days or weeks. For all he knew, it could have just been a few seconds. It was as though everything around him had shut down, and when he came to, he had his dad's dictionary in one hand and his glasses in the other. He wondered if he would have even been able to come to himself if not for these two things. Even so, he didn't quite feel like he had the energy to stand. Every cell of his body had been wiped clean, moving in what felt like slow motion. His high vitality had no ability whatsoever to help him recover, or at the very least, not anytime soon. It was a feeling that he would have called suffocating, if not for the fact he couldn't quite remember if he had breathed, or if he even needed to breathe. He lay on his back, looking up at the endless depths. He wondered, it seemed that this trial world was actually an incomplete world of its own. But it was completely devoid of life, well, outside of those that would come here from time to time. It was quite fascinating. He wondered how the creator of Dimensional Cleanse had managed to make it so easy to cross from one world to another without an extraordinary power source. Although he could copy the method and rearrange the chemical structure as he saw fit, copying and understanding were two completely different things. It was so far beyond him that he couldn't wrap his head around it, but it was also fascinating for exactly that reason. What other discipline could allow a layman to copy a master so precisely and execute the same results with repeated certainty? It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. Lionel's head shifted, and he looked down at the pair of glasses in his hands. He had squeezed them pretty hard, all of his strength, in fact. But they didn't so much as creak. It was an odd feeling. He was sure that even if there was an eighth-dimensional item in his hand, even if he couldn't destroy it, it would at least have some give to it. But this had nothing of the sort. He wondered how much effort his father had put into it, how many hours of work. Lionel looked away. That was the thing with tears. If you let them go once, the second time would come even easier, and the third even easier than the second. Eventually, you would be as worthless as a crying baby, curled up on a starry road when there were treasures to be had not too far away. He thought this, but he still didn't move. Say something, old man, he mumbled to himself. Ping, Lionel's gaze flashed, but he didn't react as violently as one might expect. In fact, he didn't even look toward the dictionary. Finally finished crying? I'm quite touched. What was that, 27 hours? Sheesh, not bad if I do say so myself. Lionel's lip curled into a slight smile. He knew that it was a message. By now, he understood enough about crafting to know how his father had done it. The usual mechanical voice of the dictionary, a version of his father's voice without life in it, was done on purpose to lull Lionel into a certain belief. In reality, all of the dictionary's messages could be in just as lifelike of a voice if his father had so chosen. But he preferred the chance at pranking his son instead. That said, there were indeed many things within the dictionary that were pre-recorded, but there were even some pre-recordings within that presented themselves as such that were, in reality, just the dictionary speaking. This was one such example. The finally finished crying part was pre-recorded. The 27 hours part was deduced by the dictionary on its own. The dictionary was definitely a complex system that brought most AI to shame, and if not for his father's pranks, Lionel would have noticed long ago. This dictionary was maybe the greatest invention of his father. It wasn't casually cobbled together as Velasco had made it seem. In fact, if its intelligence were to be measured against Lionel's, it would definitely be smarter, and not just by a small margin either. If there was one item in the dimensional verse that was the equivalent to the hourglass of the Pluto race, it was definitely this small silver disc in his hands. Its abilities were simple, but it was in this simplicity that it was so shocking and amazing. "Yeah, I'm done crying, old man," Lionel muttered. "Lame. I thought I could at least milk this out for a few more years. Who knew that my seed wouldn't be as useless as I thought him to be?" Lionel remained silent, still not answering. "If you're hearing this message, I'm dead." "Shut up," Lionel almost rolled his eyes. "You couldn't come up with anything less cliché? All that brain power, wasted. You should have used it to at least leave me behind a few starships." "Bah, starships, what useless things. Even you managed to single-handedly down one, what good would they be to me? Don't talk big when you're dead." The dictionary fell into silence. "Some things have to be done. How far you go now will be up to you. Now stop moping. There's only one thing I programmed this thing to tell you because I knew you would be too stupid to ask. Whatever you do, do not trust the demoness. She only wants one thing, and that's to see the world in chaos. Why would I trust her in the first place, stupid old man? You now have daddy issues, who knows? It might be easier for another member of your family to slip through the cracks. She's your grandmother, after all." Chapter 22-24. Published at 10th of October 2023 1:26 and 19 seconds p.m. Chapter 22-24. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 22-24. Snores. Lionel didn't react violently either. Maybe he was just in a numb kind of mood, but this was also how he always was. He had spent most of his life thinking his mother was dead. Actually, he had felt that that was probably the lesser possibility, the greater of which being that she had abandoned them. It was the only reason he could think of for why his father didn't tell him about her. Of course, now he knew it was just a matter of necessity. Telling him about Alienor would have meant exposing the Void Palace because on modern-day Earth, there was simply no excuse for not being able to see anyone. You could travel from one end of the planet to another in just a few minutes, and even if there was some reason you couldn't, even 21st century Earth had countless communication methods, let alone modern-day Earth. If his father had tried to lie that way, rather than being indifferent toward his mother, he would have probably been resentful toward her for making his father have to come up with so many lies. When he had finally learned that his mother was alive after the metamorphosis, he had reacted with a shrug. He never really cared. He never cared enough to ask about her, and he didn't care enough to find out the truth about her, so why would he care that she was alive? It was only after awakening his dream force and recalling every bit of his memories did he know that he could have love for his mother without letting her off the hook for something so egregious as not staying in her own child's life. So, when he learned that this mysterious woman was his grandmother, he didn't care. Even when he thought about the so-called love triangle between King, the Silver Emperor, and her, he still hadn't cared. The idea that his grandfather was potentially a cuckold didn't really move the needle for him at all. There wasn't much you could do against such a powerful woman. Plus, that love triangle was nothing but a folk tale. He had no real evidence for it. If she wanted to bed you, you could probably only accept it. If she wanted to leave you afterward, well, it was only right. You should thank your lucky stars at that point. At best, Lionel's thoughts just drifted to the fact that the lineage factors of the Morales and the Silver Empire were so similar. It seemed that the connection all along was this woman. But beyond that sort of understanding, he was still indifferent. However, Velasco obviously knew his son well, so he wasn't waiting for Lionel to ask questions. As he had said, this was the very reason he had left behind such a message, so he wouldn't let Lionel's tendencies stop him from speaking. He rarely explained anything, so the fact he was going out of his way to do this meant that it was important. I don't understand much about the relationship between your grandfather and grandmother, but what I know is that she was never of this world. This place was nothing more than a playground for her because something had caught her attention. I'm not sure what that something was, but I have my deductions. It's likely related to the simulations. Velasco spoke this as a matter of fact that everyone should know. It was either he was trying to get a rise out of Lionel, or he simply felt that if Lionel hadn't figured it out by now, he would be too foolish to be his son. Or, rather, his seed. That dumbass who calls himself king, who can't even withstand a single spear of mine, most definitely isn't strong enough to create these worlds as they are. Only a race of being far above could allow this to happen. Turning worlds into a playground of breeding just to form a large group of powerful soldiers in a short amount of time is beyond what the Three-Finger Cult and their backers are capable of. I believe that this is what caught the attention of your grandmother. If you hate her so much, why are you still calling her that? Lionel muttered to himself. Even now, he was still acting as though he was alone. It was easier that way. What would he look like allowing an AI to become his new father? I call her that out of respect for my father and nothing else, Velasco suddenly said coldly before continuing as though nothing had happened. Only something of that magnitude was enough to catch her attention. As for why she did all the things afterward, I have no way of knowing why she did. But I know that she has an eye on you. That's something you're going to have to deal with on your own. If you hated her so much, you should have tried to kill her on your own. She never had a direct hand in your grandfather's death. That was entirely the work of King, and precisely why he is now dead. As for her, she's a puppet master that prefers to be hands-off. Her plans are probably only known and understood by her. Silence fell. All right, I'm off. What you do with this information is up to you. Also, stop being such a crybaby, you're a grown man. Stop chasing the impossible. Focus on what you can do with absolute certainty. Only fools overestimate themselves. Then there's me, who finds it impossible to overestimate myself, haha. The voice faded, and Lionel fell into his own silence once again. Lionel continued to stare into the vast emptiness above him. Himself, and even the endless starry road, and even the enormous vital star in the far-off distance seemed to be entirely too small. Lionel closed his eyes, and his father's glasses and the dictionary disappeared from his hands. Then, he simply fell asleep. Soon, his light snores filled the trial world. Chapter 22-25. Published at 10th of October 2023 1:26 and 19 seconds p.m. Chapter 22-25. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 22-25. Click. Lionel woke up quite slowly and casually jumped to his feet. Without much thought, he turned toward the enormous star in the distance and began to walk toward it. The feeling was familiar. Even with the strengthening of his body, the limitations were all the same. He couldn't access his other abilities, and the only thing that seemed to respond to him was the very same vital star force that was around him. But such a thing was hardly able to stop his steps. The avatars he faced fell down one after another, and he didn't even feel the need to lift a finger. They died beneath the rampaging of his force, a feeling that seemed to carry a hidden sort of anger despite the fact he felt far better now than he had before. It wasn't long before he had already crossed past the distance he had already traveled before. Of course, there were no human enemies to face this time, so the path ahead was leisurely. He came to only a brief pause when he crossed the region he had fallen to Amory in, but that was a shadow that he had long since gotten rid of. It was no longer enough to move him so greatly. Soon, he found himself beneath the enormous blue star. This close up, he could see that the dancing runes on its surface were unlike anything he had ever seen before. It made the runes on his vital star seem insignificant and small, not just in size, but in raw complexity and even in beauty. Lionel knew with a glance that this was most definitely past the impetus state, it was likely even past the life state, though he had no reference to use to make certain of this. If he fused with his star, his greatest force would likely no longer be his dream force, and it wouldn't even be his Scarlet Star force either. Even so, he didn't even want to think about the implications. What kind of stamina drain would it be to try and use such force? How much focus would it take? Would forming a wisp of it suck his dream force dry? It was a joke to even consider it. That said, due to the words of that man, he had felt that there was another secret stored away within Dimensional Cleanse, and he finally understood what it was. Dimensional Cleanse was a technique that he had originally chosen because he felt that it matched together with his ability index quite well. He had felt that it could strengthen his dream force, or rather soul force at the time, and help him upgrade his ability index from the C- grade ability he had thought it to be back then. As he continued on with his practicing of the technique, he had learned quite a lot about it. For example, the oddity of the six-dimensional layer in forming a complex natural force art that could allow for the breeding of auspicious air, or its seemingly odd connection with universal force. But after he had broken through into the seventh dimension, and also came to understand some things from that man's words, he understood what the true purpose of Dimensional Cleanse was. It was a technique that used dream force for the sake of polishing one's other forces. The connection with auspicious air, the melding with universal force, these were all foundational layers that could allow one to reach the ultimate goal. The cleansing of one's force, its refinement, and its compression into higher and higher states. It was obvious if one thought about it, how else could it be compatible with every other technique? That was the ultimate truth. The reason Dimensional Cleanse could be used along with other techniques was because it wasn't like other techniques at all, at least on the surface. Staring at this star, and having reached the conclusions he had, Lionel had thought of a very obvious question. If Dimensional Cleanse was so free and loose with its restrictions, then why Vital Star Force? To save someone? That's what that man seemed to imply he would have to do, but why would Vital Star Force be the best for this? If anything, of the healing forces, Vital Star Force would probably be the worst at saving someone. It was a type of life force that could only be used on the body and was useless against the mind. It also couldn't be transferred over to others, or else Lionel would have long since built a healing force art around Vital Star Force instead of the light force he always used instead. It just didn't make any sense. And if he took a step back and took the man's words as skeptically as he wanted to, then it made even less sense for Vital Star Force to appear here when this was obviously a technique best paired with Soul and Dream Force. Using Vital Star Force in place of it wouldn't even work. But then Lionel thought of something. Star Fusion. Star Fusion, Combustion. Star Fusion, King's Might. These were three techniques, though really just one, that he had personally created. It was interesting. He had created these techniques while he was still within the third dimension, and he had broken through into the fifth dimension in this very place. And yet, despite his inexperience at the time, aside from some tweaking, he found that his Star Fusion technique was even more useful now than it had been in the past, and it was perfectly flexible. But it finally clicked. Dimensional Cleanse wasn't just a technique of the mind. The reason it could be paired with other techniques was because of its innate flexibility, but most importantly because it was never paired with a bodily portion. A portion Lionel felt that he finally understood now. The reason Star Fusion was so good was because when he had created it, he had been deducing the fourth dimensional layer of Dimensional Cleanse, a layer that was, ironically, related to the body, and also a layer that he had neglected until now. Star Fusion just might be more related to Dimensional Cleanse than he had originally assumed. Chapter 22-26. Published at 10th of October 2023 1:26 and 19 seconds p.m. Chapter 22-26. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. That's right. Lionel suddenly thought back, trying to remember his exact state of mind back then. For some reason, it felt a bit foggy, something that he wasn't used to. It was as though two separate memories of the same thing were overlapping, but both just slightly different from each other. But then those two memories became three, then four, then eventually they weren't memories of anything, but rather probabilities and deductions. His mind went blank, and he felt a heavy overflow of fatigue and dizziness that didn't stop until he forcefully stopped himself from thinking about it anymore. What was that? Lionel frowned. He had never experienced something like that before. It was like he was trying to deduce his own memories, but that was ridiculous. No, it's like I was trying to think of other possibilities that might fit with that timeline, but that's... Lionel was taken aback. He understood. He was making an attempt to find a perfect string of events that could have occurred in that moment, leading him right back to where he was now. But the number of possibilities was truly infinite. No one in existence should have a mind that powerful, let alone his current self. Though he understood the what he couldn't understand was the why. And even if he had succeeded, what would have been the purpose? He had a dark thought, but he didn't even want to go down that road. It threatened to make him frustrated once more, and it almost brought him right back to that broken state. The words that Ryan had spoken echoed in his mind, and the supposed uselessness of the hourglass was put on full display. Wasn't it obvious? He could think of thousands, tens of thousands, billions, even, of possibilities that would lead him right back to this very same state, as though the present was a rubber band fixed at two ends. No matter how much the past changed, the beginning and the present would stay the exact same. Lionel clenched his fists. He had thought of many useless abilities of the ability index in the past, but this one was most definitely at the very top. He took a breath, steadying his beating heart and going back to his original thoughts. He made himself calm down and focus. Then, he finally completed the loop on his initial thoughts. It goes right back to the soul again. It seems that I don't need cleansing waters after all. From the very beginning, dimensional cleanse was capable of doing it for me. Not just this, but it should even be able to steadily increase the state of my body as well. That man is an arrogant prick, but this technique is truly genius. It wasn't that Lionel didn't understand, the man was implying that he was himself. Only a fool wouldn't understand, and Lionel was probably the furthest from. He didn't acknowledge it for one reason and one reason alone. If even that version of him couldn't bring his father back to life, he didn't want to be him. He would become someone else. That was all the thought he needed on the matter. He didn't care about anything else, and now that he had understood how dimensional cleanse truly worked, he didn't have the time to think of anything else either. But first, the star path beneath his feet rumbled, and the star before him quaked and then suddenly split right down the middle as though it was hiding a ship within. But out from within, tendrils of white gold shot out, piercing toward Lionel like roaring vipers. Lionel's body flickered, and he danced out of range. He had never thought that tentacles could be beautiful, but that was precisely what was before him, a gorgeous sight. The movement of this enormous tentacle beast was like watching streams of golden light descend from the sun, peeking through the misty beauty of a day right after rain. Unfortunately, it was just as gorgeous as it was deadly. There were two problems that Lionel needed to figure out, both of which were probably quite important. If this was little Tolly, why was he attacking him? While he was in Ryan's body, he had had full autonomy, and that was a Pluto. Why didn't little Tolly? Or did that mean that little Tolly did have autonomy and simply chose to attack him anyway? Had the mutation failed and was his little metal spirit still rampaging? Or was it something else? The second problem was, obviously, how to separate little Tolly from this beautiful creature. The void race entity had done it with a simple shout, but Lionel obviously wasn't at that level, so what could he do? Surprisingly, Lionel had only just thought of the question when he had thought of an answer, for the second, anyway. As for the first, well, he would just have to find out. Lionel came to a grinding halt, the tips of his toes gliding along the starry road until he came to a stop. With a pulse of light, his divine armor manifested, his halo bouncing to his feet then back up. Before his armor could even solidify, he had already surged forward, his speed impossibly fast. He weaved through countless golden tendrils. The creature felt sluggish for some reason, as though it had yet to wake up properly. If he wanted to do this, he had to do so swiftly. His body shot into the splitting star, looking for something that could be considered to be a core. But for a creature that could fill up the insides of a star, just how large was it? I've seen bigger just this week alone, Lionel thought to himself, flashing forward and appearing in a mass of tendrils so deep he had to continuously move about just to avoid being crushed to pieces. By this point, he almost believed that this creature didn't even know he was here. He was too small and insignificant. But there was no telling what would happen if it truly awoke. There. Lionel dove in and crashed down, his body suddenly lighting up with a roaring vital star force. Chapter 22-27. Published at 10th of October 2023 1:26 and 19 seconds p.m. Chapter 22-27. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel had deduced something quite profound. From the very beginning, dimensional cleanse had had three aspects. The first three stars were meant to be related to one's most confident forces, the second three related to one's body, and the last three in relation to one's mind. Lionel had done this in an inappropriate order. His first had been formed from his mind because that was all he was thinking about when he was forming his techniques. Forming his stars had been so easy in comparison to others that he had been able to easily skip steps that others had to worry and slave over. But it was also precisely because of this that he had always considered dimensional cleanse as a supplemental technique, a technique that was most useful on the mind. The most shocking part was that his mind was so powerful that he often didn't use the benefits of dimensional cleanse either. How infrequent was his use of auspicious air? How much time did he even spend meditating on the natural force art of the sixth-dimensional layer of dimensional cleanse? The truth was almost no time at all, and that was more of a shame than anything. Now that he had put it all together, it slotted into place nicely, and everything seemed to make perfect sense. From the third-dimensional layer that laid the foundation of the force, to the fourth-dimensional layer that laid the foundation of the body, to the fifth-dimensional layer that opened up one's mind and made it sharper, faster, to the sixth-dimensional layer that opened one up to the universe, linking one with universal force and forging a path that transcended the God path. Forming the universal path. To the seventh-dimensional layer that finally stood tall upon this foundation, linked them all as one, and began to unearth the truest, deepest secrets of dimensional cleanse. Dimensional cleanse was exactly what it sounded like. It was always a cleansing technique, one that existed even beyond the scope of cleansing waters. Using your stars as a foundation, and the universe as a cauldron, one could refine not just one's body, but one's very existence toward the limit of perfection. To make a complicated matter simple, the problem of humans and their fused souls could be fixed by dimensional cleanse. Not only could you break free of the restrictions, but with enough effort, you could even transcend your original limits. Many months ago, when Lionel had spoken with little Nana's elder brother, he had said that the reason the four great families hid the matter of force manipulation from lessers was so that they could maintain control. If one had enough comprehension, it would be possible to break free of talent constraints, so they had to keep the restrictions in place. But even when he had said that, he hadn't thought that the changes that one could make were actually so substantial. Not only were they substantial, but just understanding a portion of them would be enough for Lionel to free little Tolly. Hidden deep within the enigma that was dimensional cleanse, there was a foundation that allowed the soul to not only separate from the body but one that allowed the soul to be used as a foundation to refine the body into a more perfect state as well. What better technique was there to accomplish his goal? Almost the instant his force blazed to life, he could already sense little Tolly within. He and little Tolly had a strong connection with each other. Maybe if it had been another existence, it wouldn't have come so naturally, but for his metal spirit, it came as easily as breathing. Come. Lionel found little Tolly and pulled hard, but very quickly his expression changed. Something was wrong. Little Tolly was fighting back against him. Lionel's heart couldn't help but skip a beat. This creature was quickly waking up quicker and quicker. If he couldn't separate little Tolly and use its momentary daze to kill it, he would definitely die here. He didn't know what this creature was, but it was beyond his understanding, and he didn't have a way of facing it. It would be fine to continue to let little Tolly control it if the little one was of its right mind, but very clearly, his metal spirit wasn't on his side right now. Lionel took a breath and exhaled. There's only assimilate. Lionel had never tried to use this two living existences right now, but he thought that since they were already of one body, it had a great chance of working. But there was immediately bad news. Well, good news and bad news. The good news was that it had worked. The bad news was that it had worked far too well. His dream force was sucked dry in an instant, and he almost directly passed out, even his hair and eyes completely dimmed from a vibrant pale violet to a sickly, flat white. How? Lionel's expression changed. The only explanation was that this creature he was trying to forcefully assimilate to little Tolly was far beyond him. In fact, saying things like that didn't quite do it justice. He even vaguely felt that this creature had to be close to the level of the void beast corpse, if not on its level. Lionel's gaze sharpened. In that case. Face pale and breathing haggard, Lionel began to move again. He truly hadn't been bluffing when he said that he could give little Blackstar the strength of the void beast, and now it seemed that he would have to prove it. With a wave of the hand, an illusory force art appeared, so large and all-encompassing that it looked like a twinkling starry sky within the waving tentacles of white gold. This formation was none other than the Dream Star Gathering Beast formation. It was a formation that Lionel had exchanged for the sake of passing on force mantras to little Blackstar and any other beasts he might reign under his control. It was meant as a shortcut to help elevate beasts past their usual talent, as they couldn't just learn like humans did. But how could such a formation be useful in the current situation? Especially when the beast beneath Lionel's feet now was a legendary beast more rarely seen than even the mighty void beast. The Infinity Beast. Chapter 22-28. Published at 10th of October 2023 1:26 and 20 p.m. Chapter 22-28. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The Dream Star Gathering Beast formation was one that used dream force as a foundation to communicate deeper concepts to a beast, concepts that couldn't always be explained by word of mouth. It was akin to translating the abstract into the manageable, at least in layman's terms. In reality, what it did was convert, extract, and transfer thoughts in their most perfect states, allowing a beast's more subtly manipulatable minds to understand things that they otherwise wouldn't be able to. It was akin to bolstering the talent of a beast in a certain aspect, and it was made easily digestible to them in the same way their talent usually allowed. Beasts in the dimensional verse, or any verse for that matter, were able to progress extremely fast. This was part of the reason why Earth's oceans were still so shockingly dangerous despite all the time that had passed. In fact, there were still beast tides from time to time that threatened the Empire. And every time Earth evolved, these beasts would get stronger much faster than their human counterparts did. Even so, there was a price to pay for this as well. Beasts could progress extremely quickly, but their talent was decided at an early age and abstract matters like force manipulation were beyond them. Essentially, while humans and other humanoid races could somewhat change their fates based on hard work and other factors, the talent of a beast was immediately decided by their ability index and beast crystals from birth. Once they reached whatever that pre-decided limit was, progressing would be impossible for them. Little Blackstar was extremely talented, and this only became more true after absorbing so much void beast blood. However, Lionel had already seen some flaws with Blackstar's progress, especially since he had someone else to compare the little guy to, Mordred. Mordred, or M as Lionel liked to call her, was a shadow sovereign just like little Blackstar, but the flexibility and unique flair she added to her ability index was unlike anything Lionel had ever seen little Blackstar perform. Of course, there was a simple answer to why, and that was because of Camelot's magic system. But that was precisely the point. Beasts couldn't even learn techniques and magic systems in the usual sense. This was where the Dream Star Gathering Beast formation came into play. But this was a lengthy explanation for something that seemed entirely useless in the situation. What good was a formation like this? What would he do with it? Ask the Infinity Beast to kill him swiftly and make it painless? The secret lay in the mechanism with which the formation worked, taking complex concepts, simplifying them, making them easily digestible. When Lionel broke down the fundamentals in how this formation worked, he immediately realized that it could do more than he had given it credit for. To make a complex matter simple, the formation could become a proxy through which he applied his abilities. But this wasn't the important part. The lineage factor of the fox had been refined across countless generations. There was even a generation of them worthy enough to have the Pluto race owe them a favor. This simply wasn't the kind of lineage factor technique that could be so easily simplified, especially not by the likes of the people of the four great families and the Dream Pavilion. What was important wasn't a modification of the lineage factors technique, but rather that the formation could be powered by external items, one, and secondly, whereas in the past he would have to first filter what information came from the items he was assimilating through himself, and then pass it on to the target, now the filtering and passing on process became one and the same, lowering the energy requirements by a large factor. In order to use, assimilate, Lionel's lineage factor had to break down a target into its component force arts, making them easily digestible, binding them with his dream force, and using said dream force as a binder to his body, thus altering his talent, or that of his souls for a short while. Breathe worked on this principle by taking it a step further, sacrificing some of the immediate strength in exchange for more permanence. The two worked together like a pair of peas in the pod, but the more troublesome the target, the more difficult it was. Doing it to himself was the easiest, although he couldn't use, breathe, on himself as he was a living being. Doing it to his souls was an extra layer of difficulty. Doing it to a living entity like little Tolly with its own thoughts and will. It was an even more difficult task. Ultimately, this formation would be what allowed it, but the true core to it all. Anastasia, I need your help. Of course you do. At least you said something and didn't just expect me to act. It seems you've woken up a little bit. I am a mighty world spirit, you know, more mighty than you know. Lionel shook his head. Now wasn't the time for showing off, but luckily Anastasia had already gotten to work. At that moment, a large amount of vital force surged forward, being converted to dream force through Anastasia's means, and then being filtered right into the formation. The star that had just split to reveal the beautiful monstrosity within became the fuel through which Anastasia worked. That was right. From the very beginning, as early as Lionel could remember, Anastasia had had an ability he didn't quite understand until just now. It was an ability that could only be described as one of a god's. To be able to freely turn a force of one kind into any other you cared to. At that moment, the slumbering infinity beast felt its strength being whittled away. But it had been asleep for too long, and its mind was groggy and unresponsive. In the end, it took this as a sign that it was still tired, not realizing that its life was being devoured by another. Chapter 22-29. Published at 12th of October 2023 5:52 and 9 seconds AM. Chapter 22-29. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 22-29. A better pairing? What Lionel didn't know was that this infinity beast was more than just tired, it was old and worn. For a creature to be so beautiful, and yet so close to the end of its lifespan, was probably something a human like Lionel who was destined to grow old and wrinkled could never truly understand. It was tired of life, tired of existence. Maybe it was fully aware of what was happening and simply couldn't be bothered to care anymore. That was all it had done in its life, care, and it cared too much. It wasn't like the void beast that destroyed all things, because it was, in fact, all things. It was all forces, all beings, and as such it understood all forces, all beings. Its sympathy was boundless, but this was like a curse, one that ate away at its very being and suffocated it for all that it was worth. Marred by this beauty, no one had ever seen its true self, that hidden interior awashed with darkness and suppressed by its own care and concern. In its final moments, it exhaled a breath of relief. Someone else would have to hold on to its burdens from now on. It was no longer its cross to bear. Lionel began to fall from the skies, the infinity beast's body having vanished into a clump of silver he held onto. He couldn't fly at all in this dense den of force arts, because even though the entire vital star had vanished, the runes that had once colored its surface were only released from their shackles, unleashing onto the world a wide range of changes that made an eighth-dimensional world's pressure feel like child's play. However, Lionel couldn't focus on the fact that he was falling right now, because it wasn't the time to. He still needed Anastasia's help to cast, breathe. Even now, Lionel didn't know what kind of beast he had just killed, nor the kind of weight that had been on its shoulders. When he had looked at the void beast, although he had reacted indifferently, he had still felt that mighty pressure coming from even its corpse. He couldn't imagine what that beast would have looked like if it had been alive. Knowing that, how could he know that this creature that he felt nothing from could possibly be its counterpart? When looking at the infinity beast, he felt that it was somewhat forgettable aside from its gorgeous exterior. As though he had never seen its true self. Due to this, the only thing he was focused on at the moment was making sure that the impermanence of assimilate didn't ruin little Tolly's chances. Of course, he was also worried about little Tolly turning on him, and the best way to deal with that was to use the excess energy that little Tolly would have now and turn it into the little guy's future potential instead. With that move, he would both weaken little Tolly significantly and make any potential rampage manageable, and he would also secure his metal spirit's future. It was a win-win situation, so he acted immediately. This time, little Tolly didn't resist. Lionel could sense a faint bit of the little one's intention to devour the power itself, but it immediately realized that it simply had no ability to and left matters in Lionel's hands. Lionel almost laughed when he sensed this, one because this was the most complex thought that he had ever heard come from little Tolly, so he was certain that the maturing process had gone well, and two because this little guy was exceptionally greedy. While he didn't know what kind of beast that beautiful creature had been, he was certain that it was at least beyond the level of the ancestors of this world. So, the fact that it could be so strong, and yet not dealt with by the regulator, made Lionel feel that just maybe, it might be closer to the entity of the void race than not. Whatever the truth was, Tolliver was truly too greedy thinking that he could devour something like that on his own after only just entering the sixth dimension. Anastasia helped Lionel with the force conversion once again. Luckily, this burden was much lower because much of the energy came from the residual force of the infinity beast itself. So, even though the vital star was gone, there was plenty left to deal with this situation. Boom! Lionel crashed to the ground and coughed out a mouthful of blood. It had been a long while since he had been worried about gravity of all things, but looking at little Tolly, he grinned, feeling that it was worth it. In truth, he had been a bit worried. That beast didn't look like it had metal attributes, and Lionel had learned long ago that more abilities wasn't as good as abilities that coincided with your current path. For example, with the silver tablet, he had been able to steal the ability indexes of others for a long while, but he never had. That was because he knew that he could very easily cripple himself doing so. But looking at little Tolly, it seemed that he had worried too much. He didn't know why, but he felt that little Tolly had reached a level he couldn't imagine, a level that reminded him of those two god races he had just seen. Despite being of the sixth dimension, the pressure the little one gave him was suffocating. Little Tolly was still that same adorable little silver blob, but within that silver there were densely packed runes of white gold that looked like the ancient markings of a long-forgotten temple. Lionel looked up toward the floating and fading force art runes in the twinkling skies and immediately sat upright. He had to study these as much as he could before they faded away completely. Comprehending them himself was far better than just assimilating them, that way he wouldn't have to worry about anything else. In his focus, he forgot about Tolliver's changes for a moment. Of course, Lionel had no idea that he had just helped his metal spirit assimilate one of the strongest beasts in all of existence. What better pairing could there be for a crafter's partner than the beast of creation itself? Chapter 2230. Published at 12th of October 2023 5:52 and 25 seconds AM. Chapter 2230. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2230. Harmony. Lionel's gaze flickered again and again as it danced across the floating runes. Part of his senses were focused on little Tolly, just in case the little guy still felt that it was necessary to attack him, but outside of that, he was entirely focused. Right now, his vital star force was the weakest of his force, most probably. Even his void star force was able to keep up because he could use it as a reflection of his scarlet star force. It hadn't even stepped out of the unfurled state in, and that was quite pathetic. If his vital star force was at the same level as his spear force, for example, just the strength of the lowest level of his star fusion technique would be hundreds of times more powerful, and by extension, his divine armors would be as well. Honestly, even that might still be an underestimation. The potential of star fusion was probably beyond what he knew it to be now that he could subtly feel its connection with dimensional cleanse. They could feed into one another and he could use it to strengthen himself far more with dimensional cleanse as a foundation. That said, the importance of vital star force was beyond just this alone. If Lionel was correct about the true purpose of dimensional cleanse, then it along with his dream force would be the foundation upon which he brought his body beyond its current level and shed past the original weakness of the human race. This was more important for Lionel now than it ever had been, especially since he had learned who his supposed grandmother was. Someone had messed with his uncle. This was one of the few things he was able to recall from his experience as his enlightened self. It was also possible that someone had messed with him as well, though he wasn't certain. What he did know was that the reason he was only able to spend such a short amount of time in that enlightened state was for one reason only: his body could handle the strength of his soul. This made sense because he was a human. What didn't make sense was how such a soul was born into such a weak body in the first place, and the answer to that question was exactly why he felt that someone had potentially messed with him just like they had his uncle. Thinking back to how his father had also placed some sort of seal on him, Lionel felt that this matter likely still wasn't as simple as he thought. But he didn't want to waste time asking the dictionary questions now. There would always be time for that. His only goal right now was to increase the state of his vital star force. His body shook and his eyes blazed with a blue light that calmed quickly. First layer, he mumbled to himself before focusing once again instantaneously. His mind split countless ways, analyzing each one of the rules one by one, splicing them together and forming a complete picture. The more he did this, the more the back of his mind rumbled with a certain thought. This feeling, wasn't it similar to his current mage core? Those branches, those leaves, each one adorned with a partial rune, separate and yet whole. It was quite a fascinating feeling. Second layer. Lionel's progress sped up as an auspicious air formed around him. Dimensional cleanse was actively aiding him in comprehending faster and faster, and in a reverse sort of scenario from what he had expected, comprehending seemed to get easier rather than harder. Then it clicked. While he was analyzing all of these runes one by one and piecing together the ones that made sense, he was also discarding many of them at the same time. The ones that he discarded didn't just vanish from his memory, they were recycled and then used again when it made sense. Recycled and then used again. The words reminded Lionel of nature, of how the death of one being could easily become the fuel for another, a fertilizer of the earth, a fertilizer that could grow plant life, sustain wildlife, to give trees life. Within Lionel's ethereal glabella, an ancient tree with rainbow-colored leaves stood at the center of it all, looking as though it held up both the skies and the 10 stars that surrounded it. It was gorgeous, and looked like a being that existed beyond imperfection, beyond stain and impurity. A gentle wind blew by and its leaves lifted, rustling. This common feature of nature came with a gorgeous sound, a resonance that could enlighten Buddha and force devils to turn over a new leaf. Beautiful in its bearing, simple in its grace, peaceful in its presence. Lionel's own hair seemed to rise up and the complex force arts of dimensional cleanse began to grow as well. For as long as he could remember, the natural force art that he had formed at the 6th-dimensional layer of dimensional cleanse had been buried within the soil. It didn't seem to matter to him as where it was hardly relevant. Until now. The magic system of Camelot and dimensional cleanse seemed to fuse into a single being. Lionel didn't know how to describe it, but as the skies of his ethereal glabella fell into darkness, and then slowly brightened, only to fall into brightness once more and continue to cycle, but it felt as though his ethereal glabella had reached a state of absolute harmony. As though a collection of images had become one beautiful painting, perfect and whole. His hair gently waved in this mysterious wind and the undersides of their filaments radiated with a familiar rainbow color. The speed of his deduction became even faster and he slid into the 3rd layer, and then soon the 4th. By the time the last of the sparkling runes had vanished, he stood at the quasi-impetus state, his body thrumming in harmony. Chapter 2231. Published at 12th of October 2023 5:52 and 25 seconds AM. Chapter 2231. If audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again. Chapter 22:31 Bad Taste. Lionel opened his eyes slowly and exhaled. His strength hadn't improved in a tangible way, as he was still in Tier 1. But if one was to say that his power was the same, they would be sorely mistaken. In fact, he felt that staying at Tier 1 was the far better decision as well. If he could, he might even choose to return to the 6th dimension. He had been too hasty in progressing. The more powerful you were in terms of tiers, the more difficult the hurdle to clear was if you wanted to improve your forces. Lionel could also feel that within Dimensional Cleanse, the best state for him to improve his body the most would have been in the 6th dimension as well. While he could still feel large progress in the 7th, he felt that he would have gained even more had he been weaker. There was no use in regretting it, but it was something that he kept in mind for the future. It would be a harder path, but he could still reach the end. He also couldn't help but note that the creator of Dimensional Cleanse hadn't given him the 8th dimension layer or the 9th dimensional layer. The meaning behind this was obvious. He wanted Lionel to deduce the rest just like he had the first several layers. It would benefit him far more to do this. Lionel stood to his feet. To his surprise, little Tolly reacted, squirming up his arm and spreading across his hand, wrist, and up his shoulder and even part of his chest. He coated Lionel like a sleeve, turning his left arm into a gorgeous pattern of silver and white gold. A slight smile spread across Lionel's face. He could feel that the little guy was trying to say sorry. It seemed that it was still forming more and more complex thoughts. He felt like a parent watching his little toddler grow up. After a while, his expression grew more serious and his gaze became cold. He could feel the forces singing around him, so he also knew that this world was going to collapse soon. The unfortunate part was that he didn't know how to go back. He had to actively enter this space by clearing the puzzle, but when you were sent out, it was automatic. There obviously wasn't the same clear process. He had to figure something else out. Suddenly, he felt movement from little Tolly. The little guy was just messing around, feeling happy that Lionel didn't blame it. But the movement and the strong connection between the two of them made Lionel suddenly realize something. I'm thinking faster, but my dream force didn't increase. The only explanation. Little Tolly was acting like something akin to an innate node, but this time for his dream force. Lionel's eyes widened, and he suddenly remembered something. That was right, one of the paths for metal spirits was related to crafting stamina and helping their partner to be able to craft for longer periods of time. But this felt like it was beyond that. Lionel subconsciously felt that it wasn't just crafting stamina that little Tolly could help with, but there was a noted improvement to all of his forces. Though not as exaggerated as improving an entire stage, this was surprising. Lionel knew that helping little Tolly break through like this would give him access to all of the spirit's paths, but what he didn't expect was that the power would be so immediate. Taking this path was supposed to be like making your metal spirit a jack of all, and master of none. But for Lionel to be able to feel this change so intimately, it felt more like little Tolly was already a master of all. It could only be that beast, that's the only explanation. Lionel shook his head. He had to think about this less and more about how to survive. The obvious answer was to reverse the chemical structure he had used to get here, but that was stupid. He knew it was, so he didn't even try it. He didn't even know what reverse would mean in this context. What surface would he use to reverse the chemical structure? Up and down? Left, right? Across all planes? He didn't even know. The truth was that returning would likely have its own unique chemical structure, one that he wasn't strong enough to even begin deducing. There had to be something else. Lionel's gaze flickered again and again. How to return home, how to return. Suddenly, Lionel's left arm raised into the air on its own and tapped. Little Tolly did a small happy dance in his mind as though it had done something great, and Lionel's brows raised. Well, even if he leads me into the middle of a black hole, I might be able to live a few more seconds. Lionel jumped into the portal, but to his astonishment, he stood right where he had left, right beside El Ryan, and the latter even seemed to still be talking. I'm not sure why you did that. Quartz has an interesting structure, yes, but it's ultimately still a third-dimensional material without any force to speak of. It's only useful here because the target is Earth itself. Elryan trailed off, looking at Lionel for the first time since he began his payback. He could feel just how different Lionel was, and when he looked at the silvery white gold sleeve on his left arm, his pupils constricted. From his words, it was clear that Elryan was most definitely not a crafter. But he was still a Pluto. He knew the aura of an infinity beast when he saw it. No, it was more accurate to say that those of his family line would. Even weaker Pluto, though still far beyond the human race, wouldn't recognize what they were seeing. That was because the infinity beast was the rarest creature in all of existence. But how did Lionel change in the blink of an eye? And that quartz crystal? Wasn't it just in his hand? Where had it gone? You. Lionel gave the boy a glance. At this point, that was all he could be bothered to see him as. Your Pluto race is quite strong, right? Then you should probably be able to understand what's supposed to happen in this zone. How about you tell me? Elryan's brows shot up. He almost subconsciously answered as though he owed Lionel a response. This sort of feeling shouldn't come from a human. And why did him saying the Pluto race was powerful leave such a bad taste in his mouth? Of course, you could not tell me. But then I'd make repaying this favor of yours impossible, Lionel said with a bright smile. How embarrassing would it be if the mighty Pluto race couldn't repay their benefactors? Elryan's expression darkened. Chapter 2232. Published at 16th of October 2023 12 o'clock and 52 seconds p.m. Chapter 2232. He did. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. No v. LB/1 N. Chapter 2232. He did. Lionel's words hit a sore spot, but it was also probably the easiest deduction he had made today. One didn't need to be nearly as smart as him to understand what was going on here. The Pluto were in a strained situation. That much was obvious by the conversation between Elryan and Shanrei, and even further by the actions of that void race entity. Lionel also now knew the value of these incomplete worlds. This world was valuable enough to be used as the top currency of these god races, and more importantly than that, as the currency of the most powerful among them. And yet, in order to repay this favor, the Pluto not only made the decision to use these incomplete worlds that could have been of great benefit to helping them out of their current situation, but they had also offended the Void race and supposedly several other god races. As though all of that wasn't enough, Elryan, a junior of the Pluto race, albeit of high standing, was given the hourglass to command. No matter how you sliced it, repaying this favor was so important to the Pluto race that they were willing to make sacrifices to do so. Of course, Lionel was very curious as to why this was. He didn't believe that there was anyone with such a good heart, and the current Fox were far too weak to demand anything of the Pluto race. In fact, Lionel believed that they had never been even remotely strong enough, and it was instead a unique set of circumstances that allowed them to have the ability to cash in such a favor to begin with. That meant there was a deeper reason, a more fascinating one that he probably wasn't even of high enough standing to be privy to. But whatever that reason was, it didn't matter to him for now. All that mattered was that this could be used as the leverage he needed to make this matter far easier on him. He had already failed this zone, that much was inevitable. However, his current understanding of zones was beyond what it had been in the past, far beyond. Just because he had failed, didn't mean that he couldn't still reap the rewards, and it also didn't mean that he couldn't force the zone to recognize itself as being cleared. Ever since he had entered the Dwarven race's zone, he had come to understand that zones were large constructions of dream force. That said, eighth-dimensional zones like this one were very different. It had to be remembered that from the seventh dimension onward, treasures would be taken out of zones. That meant they had a more physical form, a form that transcended beyond what could be expected of lower-level zones. While this would make them more difficult to manipulate, Lionel was still quite confident. He wasn't even worried about returning home. All he was worried about was maximizing his chances here, and in order to do that he would need information. He could gather this information himself, but it would likely take months, and time wasn't something that he felt like wasting if he had other options. As for dealing with this rather large baby here, he felt that it was as easy as turning over a palm, especially since he doubted it would cost Elryan anything to speak of these things. Thinking back to the hourglass, Lionel believed that it was exactly because it existed that Elryan and the other Pluto were so free here, and it was also because of this that he was confident that Elryan would be able to meet his demands. That said, none of this meant that the Pluto would be very happy about it, especially when he had just believed himself to have the upper hand. I don't dash, Lionel shook his head and sighed. Let's skip the back and forth, shall we? You'll say you don't believe me, when in reality you already do. Then you'll ask me to prove myself, which I inevitably want. And then you'll take action and do something to piss me off, and then I'll do the thing you claimed I couldn't that you already believed I could, and then we'll both be unhappy. So how about instead, I just say, sorry for my rudeness, oh great Pluto. If you'll allow this humble human a chance to see his mother and future wife again, he'll be ever so grateful. Elryan's lip twitched. He had had more changes in facial expression today than he had in his last 14 years. His mother had always said he came out a deadpan baby, but now all of that seemed to be getting thrown out of the window. Lionel's praise was even more grating on the ears now than when he had called the Pluto powerful. He had never thought that hearing positive affirmation would be so disgusting. He could tell that Lionel didn't even mean a word, and worse than that, he didn't even try to hide that he didn't. He could understand if Lionel was ignorant to the matters of the god race, but it was impossible for him to be so after all of these events, and especially not with. He looked down at the coat of silver and white gold runes that had taken over Lionel's left arm, feeling the annoyance within him growing. After a moment, he simply stopped and exhaled a breath. It was as though he chose to not be annoyed anymore and simply wasn't. Lionel smiled. He found that action to be somewhat familiar. He wondered when it would be Elryan's turn to boil over and lose it. What do you want to know? Don't you already know? This zone, what is it, what's its purpose, which other bodies were taken over by the two other entries, and how can I get the most out of it? Elryan's expression flickered for a moment, but then he took out the hourglass once more. The seconds ticked by and Lionel remained silent. He didn't seem to be impatient in the slightest. He was quite confident that Elryan would answer. And then he did. Chapter 2233. Published at 16th of October 2023, 12 o'clock and 35 seconds p.m. Chapter 2233. Mistake: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2233. Mistake N-0 Velbin. This zone seems to be related to a so-called Silver Empire. It's facing destruction at the hand of outside forces. It seems that you were given my body because these forces include those from outside of this incomplete world. Lionel's gaze narrowed. When he realized what this meant, he almost smiled a bit bitterly as well. These so-called outside forces could only be those from the Cataclysm Zone. Compared to the Pluto race members, what were they worth? Had Lionel been able to keep Elryan's body, this zone wouldn't have been able to be any easier. It might even be the easiest zone he had ever completed. That said, there was no going back, and the matter also wasn't as simple as it seemed either. That's because without Elryan, he wouldn't be able to understand this zone so easily. He had gained Elryan's body, not his memories, so he hadn't even known that a treasure as valuable as the hourglass had been on him. He couldn't remember Elryan holding any spatial treasures. Setting aside those feelings, this explanation didn't feel complete, and there were too many questions. Was he supposed to save the Silver Empire? But with how real this zone felt, wouldn't that change the timeline of the future? Or was the goal something else entirely? The Silver Empire is meant to be destroyed, but there is a tablet that you must recover before it can be. From my understanding, your future wife is currently the Emperor, while your mother is the current leader of a family that goes by the Luxniks. She is called Northern Star Order. Lionel frowned. Northern Star Order was one of the hegemonic titles of the Luxniks. Northern Star Order, Wise Star Order, and Snow Star Order, these three represented great things. The problem was that according to Wise Star Order, there had only ever been one Northern Star Order in the history of the Luxniks, the rest having all been fabrications by him, all 13 of them. Knowing this, the problem was obvious. That one Northern Star Order should be his grandmother. His grandmother was old, but she wasn't this old. This timeline at best should be around the time Y's Star Order was born. At worst it was a generation before even Y's Star Order's father was born. From Lionel's understanding, Northern Star Order should have been one of the very first Luxniks, so this didn't make any sense either. The only explanation was that Y's Star Order didn't even understand his own family's history, or that old man had tried to con him again. Now that he thought about it, basically everything he knew about Luxnik's family history was told to him by that con man. But even worse than that, even if he had gone to the family record directly, Y's Star Order had already manipulated them so that it would appear as though 13 Northern Star Orders had appeared in their history, effectively weakening his grandmother's influence on the family. Why wouldn't he have altered everything else? This was why Lionel hadn't even bothered to double-check. There was nothing to double-check against, until now. Y's Star Order was an ambitious man, and it wasn't easy to whittle that ambition down with just a few chains. He was a man who had experienced countless years and generations. He had even survived in the spiritual domain. His patience was far greater than Lionel knew. At the same time, though, the current Lionel wasn't the same Lionel of the past. Y's Star Order couldn't think faster than any longer, and even without his father's protections, he could kill Y's Star Order him. Leon's thought came to a halt. His father's death had taken quite a toll on him, and it had also exposed the fact that he was a far more caring man than Lionel knew, but that didn't change the fact that his old man was very particular about the kind of help he gave him. Even when he was in the Rapak's nest, his father hadn't done anything to help him, and there had been countless seventh-dimensional experts present. It could even be said that Velasco had made the situation worse. Because Velasco had appeared and killed all the scholars, the Rapak's elders were freed from their battles and were able to close in on Lionel and the others. Of course, in the end, they did so to reward Lionel with the black rod, but that could have very well ended badly. If Velasco's glasses had told Lionel anything, it was that while his old man was soft at heart, he was hard in his actions. He wouldn't help Lionel with such a thing, unless he had to. Back then, Y's Star Order had run circles around Lionel. Speed of thought or not, Lionel wasn't a fool, but he felt like a toddler. Could Y's Star Order be stronger than he knew? And what was his purpose, exactly? Why did he feel the need to hide the history of the Luxniks? And also, beyond that, his grandfather and his grandmother. Emperor Fox didn't seem like the type to randomly fall in love. As cruel as it sounded, Lionel had believed his grandmother to be a pawn in his grandfather's schemes for as long as he couldn't remember. But at the same time, his grandfather seemed to be restricted to staying within Earth's territory. How had he even met his grandmother? And if he could leave Earth for a price, then why did he insist on paying it to meet his grandmother? As Lionel was lost in thought, thinking of countless possibilities, he suddenly realized that Elryan had fallen into silence despite not having explained everything quite yet. He looked over toward the young boy to see that his expression was actually quite solemn. It wasn't a normal solemn, it was the kind that only appeared when one felt that they had made a mistake, a huge mistake, a mistake they couldn't reverse easily, a mistake they'd have to stay true to toward its ends. And that expression had come right after mentioning the Luxniks family. Chapter 2234. Published at 16th of October 2023 12 o'clock and 32 seconds p.m. Chapter 2234. The God Beasts. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2234. The God Beasts. Lionel didn't say anything, but he felt that he should have known after seeing that enormous void beast corpse in the skies, ridden by a race of beings he couldn't even fathom until this very moment. It was easy for Lionel to ignore the legends of the void beast because this world was so weak. Even a reasonable person could conclude that the void beast and infinity beasts were only legends in this incomplete world. However, what was becoming clearer and clearer to Lionel was that, if not for the appearance of the Pluto race, leading to the appearance of the Void race and their corpse battleship, this incomplete world wouldn't even know about these questions. This wasn't the only matter to consider either. The Luxniks family was a mere sixth-dimensional family in his eyes. Although they had gotten stronger after his grandmother's return to the fox family, they were still subordinate to the fox. Even though they only had the lowest level of the light side of the Northern Star lineage factor, why would he assume that they had the capability to have access to anything at this unconscionable level? Suddenly, Lionel's pupils constricted. N-0 Velbin, who had told him about the highest levels of the Northern Star lineage factor? Wasn't it Wise Star Order? He wouldn't have even known otherwise. The more Lionel thought about it, the more he felt that something was off. Elryan suddenly opened his mouth. Just when Lionel thought English would come out just like it had every time before, a language that sounded like the roar of dragons, with punctuation akin to claps of thunder, came out instead. Lionel felt his eardrums burst and begin to bleed, but he didn't cover them, even circulating his force so that he could heal them and hear more. It only lasted a brief few seconds, but Elryan turned to Lionel soon after. "I will go with you." Lionel's gaze narrowed. It seemed that his previous assumption was incorrect. If Elryan insisted on coming, then his thoughts that this would be an easy matter with him wouldn't be even remotely true. It seemed that there were no cheat codes to 8th dimensional zones. "Are you going to tell me why? Or are you going to just do as you please?" "This isn't a simple matter to explain," Elryan said, somewhat exasperatedly. "You seem far too concerned for someone with that hourglass on you." "That isn't that hourglass, it's the hourglass." This distinction seemed very important to Pluto race boy, who was growing more agitated by the second. "Also, that item can't be used as freely as you think. You used it on me just fine. You're insignificant. The ties of karma and the wear of time and space are almost non-existent on you. The more prominent the target, the deeper the folds of reality, the more effort it would take. Judging by what I've understood, it would take one of my seniors coming for the hourglass to still be effective." "And are they?" Lionel didn't react as though he cared about Pluto's slander at all. He was far more interested in the answer to this question. "No, we've already paid too high a price for this. It's up to me." "And me," Lionel added, in a playful mood. The more agitated he saw this Pluto boy, the funnier he thought it was. Elryan looked at him as though he might try to strangle a chicken. He was really running out of rope to give. He knew that Lionel was doing it on purpose, but that didn't make it any easier to deal with. Maybe god races were too prideful to use such tactics, but he had never met a person with such a foul mouth before. He still didn't know how Lionel seemed to have changed on a dime, but he didn't have time to think about it. "Just come," he eventually said, placing a large hand on Lionel's shoulder and taking out the hourglass. Lionel didn't resist, but he still raised an eyebrow. "You're obviously taking me because you need me, if not you would have already left. So are you going to ruin your chances by not telling me what's going on?" Elryan's jaw set as the two vanished into thin air. Lionel didn't ask again. He understood people quite well, even if they were god race beings. He only needed to say it once and then let enough time pass by that Elryan could pretend that it was his idea to explain. Sure enough, the explanation came. "You don't know why the god races exists. The management of the formation of worlds is something that's done out of necessity, not out of a will for power. There's only a limited amount of resources that existence can provide. Worlds need to die off, and you can't allow too many worlds to sprout up in their place. Before the god races, there were the god beasts. They were the embodiment of creation and destruction, and they were able to keep the balance. Though, they were also at constant war. This was the natural path of evolution, a path that existence allowed to occur. But for reasons unknown. Existence also tends toward chaos, towards disorder, towards death. Due to this, the god-beast of creation has always been at a disadvantage. The greatest embodiment of this disadvantage are the regulators. They're born with every world, and their responsibility is only to make sure that a cap of power is never exceeded and the rules of practice are followed. However, the problem is that they work using the very same force that the god-beasts of destruction use. Anarchic force. The more regulators do their job, the more anarchic force a world is filled with, and the closer to death it approaches. Eventually, a balance will be tipped once the concentration of anarchic force reaches a certain stage. At that point, just as quickly, a world will die, like a house of cards. If things continued like this, the god beasts of destruction would eventually win, but the process would be slow, too slow for them. The god beasts of destruction were not known for their patience. So, they created henchmen that shared a small portion of their bloodlines to spread chaos to the worlds. Chapter 2235. Published at 16th of October 2023, 12 o'clock and 12 seconds p.m. Chapter 2235. The Northern Star. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2235. The Northern Star. Lionel's pupils constricted. He could tell what Elryan was getting at immediately. He had only reacted like that after he mentioned the Luxnix family, and it was the Luxnix family that had access to the Northern Star lineage factor, the very lineage factor that ended in the Void Beast and the Infinity Beast, or in other words, the God Beast of Destruction and the God Beast of Creation. The so-called henchmen of the Void Beasts had to be those of the dark side of the Northern Star lineage factor. That was the only conclusion. And sure enough, the god beasts of destruction realized a problem, though. Their bloodlines were far too powerful. Even the current god races couldn't take them without dying agonizing, slow deaths. So they took a different approach, splitting the aspects of their bloodlines into 5 pieces and building them up like stepping ladders. They created a legion of beasts, the Shadow Tail, the Dusky Steel Bat, the Aurora Black Panda, the Crimson Clawed Ape and the Death Pulse Deer. Each one took up a position in the armies of the god beasts of destruction, and they were powerful. They were enormous beasts with wings that could crush the planets of this incomplete world of yours and claws that could sever stars into countless pieces. In the beginning, the god beasts of destruction felt that this would be enough. Their envoys were more powerful than they thought they'd be, and far more helpful as well, so it no longer seemed necessary to pass down their bloodline. They were haughty creatures to begin with, impatient, disdainful, and arrogant. If they didn't have to share their bloodlines, they wouldn't. But the god beasts of creation didn't roll over. Seeing the state of things and how the god beasts of destruction were acting, they realized that they could fight back in the same way, and it might even give them a chance at reversing the tide. So, they created their own beast envoys. The snowy star owl, the white stone elephant, the starry-tailed fox, the twinkling light bear, the golden tiger. The god beasts of destruction were on their back foot. Their beast envoys were incredibly powerful, but they couldn't compare to the beast envoys of the god beasts of creation. After all, they were beasts of destruction and chaos. How could they compare to god beasts of creation and creating? Having given the god beasts of creation such an idea, the god beasts of destruction regretted their action, but it was already far too late to reverse things. At the same time, the god beasts of creation felt that they could seal things, to put a final nail in the coffin, to finally end things, so they did what the god beasts of destruction couldn't and passed down their bloodline. NOVE-LB. At first, they looked through the various god races, or what they had once been, and realized that they couldn't do what needed to be done, and neither could the others, but interestingly enough, there was one race that was able to do so, and an unexpected race. The human race. Lionel fell into silence. He knew that there was much more to this story and that Elryan was far from finished, but his mind couldn't help but spin at 1,000 miles an hour. It was suffocating the number of questions he had. The human race is born with a birth defect, but it's also that defect that allowed them to take on the power of the god beasts of creation. Their souls are born fused to their bodies, but this also makes it so that there's only one variable to consider from start to finish. As you change their bodies, you can easily change their souls at the same time given that you have enough power. Like this, one of the weakest races of existence gained maybe the greatest power, and existence gained itself prosperity, a golden age the likes of which had never been seen before and would likely never be seen again. Unfortunately, this didn't last. Elryan fell into silence, looking toward Lionel with a darker expression than usual. Luckily, his rationality seemed to win over and he managed to calm himself. As for what his rationale was telling him, Lionel could guess by the way the story was going. It seemed that the palpable disdain of the human race didn't just come from their weakness. He had vaguely felt that Shanrei's vitriol whenever she spat out the word human was much deeper than it seemed to be on the surface, but even when he realized this, he just chuckled. What was this? A cliché line about how corruptible humans were and how much better other races were in comparison. What a joke. How about they be granted infinite power first and see how they dealt with it? From what he could see, these god races weren't much better. An entity that attacked his junior out of rage, what high horse did they have to sit on, exactly? As I said, existence tends towards chaos, it's just a simple rule of law. Absolute chaos must be formed first before everything can return to step one. The more energy existence expends, the closer toward death it grows. Existence is the only immortal in all of reality. The pressure of the Golden Age wasn't missed by existence, but it did nothing, it could do nothing. Existence isn't an entity, it's simply an arbitrator of rules, and the god-beasts of creation didn't break any rules, they simply followed their instinct. In fact, they did exactly as they were meant to and created. But, as existence is the only immortal, it is also the only infallible being in all of reality as well. They went overboard, spreading too much wealth and prosperity. Existence was quickly becoming overwhelmed and worlds began to collapse. Death and destruction spread ironically without even the god-beasts of destruction doing a single thing. And that was when it appeared. The Northern Star. Chapter 2236. Published at 16th of October 2023 12 o'clock and 1 second p.m. Chapter 2236. Unchallenged. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2236. Unchallenged. Elryan looked up, his expression solemn, a touch of sadness and forlornness on his expression. It wasn't the kind of face that a child should make, but Lionel felt a hint of subtlety within it, the kind that told him that this expression wasn't perfectly his, but rather one that had been passed down. It was an interesting feeling. But he felt that if the future could impact the past, then it wasn't too unacceptable. That said, he felt it was more complicated than that. N/O/V/E/L-B1. Na race like the Pluto had abilities he couldn't fathom. Even turning back time across existence wasn't outside their purview. Maybe they had a method of passing down important thoughts and feelings to their highest priority descendants. The Northern Star is quite beautiful, isn't it? Elryan suddenly said. Lionel's heart skipped a beat. Why did he suddenly feel that the Northern Star Elryan was mentioning was the very same Northern Star he was so familiar with? The Northern Star was the hope of sailors and adventurers of Earth. No matter how lost you were, so long as you pinpointed that star in the skies, you could find your way home. It was the single constant even when death had you by the ankles. However, these were mostly just folktales. The Northern Star couldn't even be seen on half of Earth, so most of the fanciful tales around it were just overblown and exaggerated. But that didn't change the fact that even the smallest child of Earth knew of the Northern Star and the kind of hope it represented. Elryan couldn't be talking about the same star, right? He was. It can be seen from everywhere, it's the constant in all of our lives, no matter where you are, it can orient your direction. But what most people probably aren't aware of is the fact that the meaning of the Northern Star is far more real and simultaneously philosophical than just that alone. The Northern Star is the central point of all of existence, but it isn't at the center of all things, it's rather at the end of all things. It's the point that we all go toward, it's the final flash of light, the penultimate representation of life before only death is left. In the past, it didn't have a prominent name because it was too far away. But the closer we get to the death of existence, the more prominent it is in the skies, the brighter it becomes, the more hope it seems to spread. Elryan fell into silence once again, trying to gather himself. His solemnness retreated and his deadpan expression took hold as he looked forward. The calmness he feigned only seemed to make the previous agitation all the worse in comparison. The source of all star force comes from the Northern Stars, and it's also the greatest center of death. Not many understand what star force is or what it represents, but I can tell you there is really no point in trying to in the first place. Just think of it as the fabric of reality. It's what gives existence substance, but more importantly than that, it brings balance, or rather, a relative balance. The more success the god beasts of creation had, the closer the star became, the stronger by comparison the god beasts of destruction became. Star force fueled them and they began to make a comeback, fiercer and stronger than before. This time, the god beasts of destruction succeeded. They passed down their bloodlines to the human race, and suddenly one of the weakest races of existence became the center of a blood war that ravaged reality. The details of this war are murky, but ultimately there was no winner. Although the god beasts of destruction had become stronger, the head start of the god beasts of creation was substantial. At the same time, it wasn't yet time for existence to collapse, so the northern star shifted the balance once again when the time came, whittling away the strong advantage the god beasts of destruction had, but not before they had sunk their claws into every aspect of existence. The gods' beasts practically went extinct after that war, but existence continued toward destruction, getting closer and closer. Every day, the northern star grows larger, and as it does, the void beasts of destruction grow as well, and soon they'll likely make a comeback of their own. Unfortunately, the time of the infinity beasts has passed. There isn't enough momentum of creation left. Elryan fell into silence. Lionel didn't say anything. He felt that he was beginning to understand how important these incomplete worlds were now. They might very well be among the last worlds that existence could create before everything collapsed. In fact, the fact there were so many incomplete worlds might be a sign in and of itself. If not for the slow weakening of existence and the approach of the northern star, there might have been far more complete worlds in this batch than what had actually occurred. Even so, Lionel had more questions than answers right now. Elryan still hadn't explained how these two separate lineage factors had suddenly become linked. Was it because of the northern star? In that case, Lionel's eyes narrowed. Could the northern star be the constellation of the lineage factors, forcefully linking them and causing the strength of one to be dependent on the weakness of the other? In that case, what happens to Lionel when the two are fused like this? Also, how is it even possible for Lionel to fuse them? It can't be that he's the first if the people of the Cataclysm Zone had both tablets as well, right? That doesn't make sense. More importantly than that, how are even the likes of the Pluto allowing such tablets to circulate at all? Why haven't they gathered them all up yet? More dark side henchmen would only speed up the descent toward chaos, while more light side henchmen would only exacerbate the problem, no? Both should be eradicated. And there was something else that Elryan had conveniently not mentioned. If even the human race could be disdained for a now faint connection, then how were the void race allowed to prance around unchallenged? What was their relation to all of this? Chapter 2237. Published at 16th of October 2023 11:59 and 51 seconds AM. Chapter 2237. Timeless event. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2237. Timeless event. Lionel frowned. There was something obvious that he was missing, and that was Elryan's reaction. Since he had reacted so violently, and even insisted on joining himself, then it likely meant that he would do something about this and they weren't ignoring the problem. But wasn't this too nonchalant? If this was such a big matter, why were the Plutos sending a junior? Something was off here. He was missing large bits of information. If this matter is so important, why are they sending you? Lionel asked. Elryan looked slightly offended when he heard this, but he quickly settled down. You don't understand. So politics, Lionel answered simply, and Elryan seemed to be quite embarrassed because Lionel's answer was spot on, so much so that he didn't even want to continue explaining. But, in the end, his better judgment won out. Novi, LB1N, there are many factions among the god race, each one with different thoughts on how to deal with this situation. Most believe that pacifism is the best choice. The last time the scales were tipped, the timeline toward destruction was accelerated. Lionel nodded. The good guys won, and instead of that being a win, it ended up being a loss. And obviously, they couldn't side with the bad guys, or else they'd just be shooting themselves in the foot. Indeed, it did sound best to just sit back and ignore everything, hoping that the natural path of balance would extend their lives for the longest. But this also seemed quite defeatist, no? The mighty god races were just waiting for their deaths. It was almost amusing. Then again, maybe they were just like humans. Elryan had said that the only immortal in all of reality was existence itself. That meant that even these gods had finite lifespans. Maybe they felt that they would long be dead by the time the northern star was the only star in the sky. It would be someone else's problem by then. They just wanted to hold on to the power they had for now. As expected, Elryan's expression was quite dark when he said this. Clearly, he wasn't resigned to this sort of fate either. Lionel found it to be a bit cute. Then he felt that maybe he was being a bit too nonchalant about this. He didn't know why, but he couldn't quite drum up the momentum to give a damn. Elryan took a breath, steadying himself. He really was all over the place today, just what was happening to him. He was better than this. Their thoughts have some logic to it. The humans that could reach the highest realms of the Northern Star lineage factor all died in the war. Those that are left can at most reach the level of the highest envoys, but those bloodlines within humans are far weaker than they would be in the real deal. This is also true for the god-beast of creation and destruction as well, but even a fraction of their power was enough to place humans on the same level as us god races. Well, at least near the middle levels of us god races. Lionel thought about the visions of those massive beasts he had seen whenever he progressed his lineage factor, and then he thought about the power he had in comparison to that, and he couldn't help but nod to himself. The snowy star owl he had seen when he awakened his lineage factor initially had been able to cross an entire galaxy with a single flap of its wings. The dusky steel bat could envelop a planet with its wings. But in Lionel's eyes, they were mere sixth-dimensional and seventh-dimensional lineage factors. They weren't even worth much in this incomplete world, let alone in the outside world. So staying hands-off made sense. Their existences were inconsequential while they risked the end of everything if they interfered with the wrong matter. Seeing Lionel be so amused with himself, Elryan gave him a glance. There is also a minority faction who think the best thing to do to remain neutral is to eradicate all humans from the face of existence. Elryan unfortunately didn't get the response he wanted out of this. Let me guess, the Void Race? Lionel asked with a laugh. Elryan's gaze flickered. No. Oh. Lionel responded, seemingly somewhat surprised, but not really. He felt that a Void Race wanting to commit mass genocide was too on the nose. They're even more extreme. They believe that the best way to extend the life of existence is to erase most of the worlds that remain. If there's a second faction after those that want to remain perfectly neutral, it's them. That's because the Void Race had evolved into a race that seemed to have an ability that might be able to reset existence. Lionel raised an eyebrow. You saw it. They can destroy worlds and absorb them into their being. Just this action alone maintains the balance exactly as is. Every time a world is about to be destroyed, one of their ancestors absorbs it instead. That action hides the destruction from the Northern Star and everything remains the same. The Northern Star hasn't moved any closer in the last at least several generations. Lionel chuckled. Wasn't there an obvious weakness to this solution? What happened when one of their ancestors died? The worlds they had absorbed would surely be noticed by the Northern Star then. At that point it would just be delaying the inevitable. You seem to have thought of the problem as well, but they feel that they can find a solution. It's just that their ancestors haven't grown powerful enough yet to break through that final barrier, to exceed the limits of the ninth dimension. They want to sacrifice as many worlds as they need to toward that end. Once again, Elryan didn't receive the response he wanted. So they want to be the universe's janitor. How noble of them. Elryan was truly speechless this time. He really didn't know how to deal with this man. You still haven't told me, though. Lionel changed the subject. What's got you so agitated this time? There's a timeless event that's about to begin. Timeless event? It's an event that will occur no matter what changes in the past or the future. Chapter 2238. Published at 16th of October 2023 11:59 and 49 seconds AM. Chapter 2238, Why Bother? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2238, Why Bother? A timeless event, huh? Lionel said softly. Timeless events usually happen when the Northern Star reached a new stage. Existence won't allow anyone to reverse such a thing, or more accurately, it's impossible to reverse. The one thing that can't be fought against is existence itself. And this time, Elryan came to a stop. The stream of stars and galaxies that had been blowing by them came to a stop, and they stood above a familiar huddle of 3 planets, but they were much different than what Lionel remembered. The 3-pillar sector was the home of the Luxnix family and 2 others, namely the Viola and Montex. The other 2 seemed to be irrelevant to the matter at hand, but Lionel still kept their names in the back of his mind because he felt that none of this was as it seemed. If all of this was really a scheme of Wise Star Order, then in all likelihood, everything had been done for a very specific purpose. Of course, Wise Star Order was also a master at sleight of hand and could very easily make him focus on something that he shouldn't be focused on at all, but his mind now was on a completely different level than it usually was. He wouldn't be tricked so easily. In the past, the 3 planets were in a perfect sort of harmony. One golden with swirling white clouds, another violet with dark hues of black, and the final with countless mountainous regions that could even be seen from the depths of space. Today, this territory was that of the Silver Empire, and the planets didn't look like what he remembered at all. This force, how can it be here? Elryan's expression changed once more. I've made a mistake, I shouldn't have come so casually. This really isn't something that I should interfere in. Elryan's expression settled down, and his words came out in a calm and calculated analysis. He had clearly seen something that he didn't like in the slightest and wanted to back out as soon as he could. Lionel didn't say anything. He felt that he understood what Elryan was trying to get at, or more accurately, he seemed to have instantly understood what force he was talking about. A spark went off through his dreamscape and it all pointed toward a single person. Richard of the Viola family and his violet force. And if that was the case, it explained everything he was seeing below. N/O/V/E/L-B1. It was like he had been transported back to the 19th century Earth. There were billowing columns of black fumes, projected out from factories that looked as though they had been pulled out straight from a black and white movie. Workers moved around like slaves, transporting things in and out of these large factors that took up all 3 planets. They seemed to cover every inch except for a single patch on the former planet Luxnix, or rather soon to be. This patch was vibrant with greenery and a river of violet. This violet, though, he felt something far different from it. Even when Richard used that force, he didn't feel moved. But now, he felt a great amount of danger. If he had been there when Richard lamented his lineage factor, maybe he would have understood somewhat. Richard had said that it felt like someone had played a sick joke on his family, giving them a power that they couldn't make proper use of at all. It was like a tumor within their soul, leeching away their lives with every passing moment. It was a truly devastating chain to be burdened with. Lionel's smile faded, and the coldness of his gaze returned. He still didn't understand what was going on, but there was one person who could give him an answer. He looked within the segmented cube. He probably should have expected it. The script practically wrote itself. Wise Star Order was nowhere to be found. In fact, if Lionel thought back, he had been nowhere to be seen ever since his father died. He just hadn't bothered to take note of it because he didn't care. And why would he need to appear at all? If this was a timeless event, then that meant that he didn't need to put his hand on the scale anymore. He had already done his job and victory was his. You shouldn't have come at all if you thought it was a timeless event, Lionel said casually. Elryan froze, but he didn't know how to respond to that. Indeed, he was far too impulsive. What could he do to change a timeless event? No, he said, somewhat forced. Timeless events are variable in that no one knows exactly what aspect of them definitely has to happen and what parts can be tweaked. A bomb might have to explode and kill many people, but the word many might be variable. It could be that only a select combination of people have to die, while the rest can be saved. You made resurrecting people sound like it was impossible, but now you want to save people who should die? Lionel asked blandly. He didn't seem to be accusing Elryan because he had never taken his words seriously in the first place. You are a truly aggravating individual. Thank you, Lionel said. Now can you tell me what this supposed timeless event is? Soon, many citizens of this Silver Empire will be gathered up and slaughtered for their parts. They'll be brought to this factory and will be refined, and it will be allowed because they are demons. Sounds simple enough to stop, just destroy the factories. What about timeless event do you not understand? Elryan's voice nearly came out in that dragon's roar once again. If we destroy these factories, they'll come up with another method, a different approach, a different path that leads to the same thing. Lionel smiled. Then tell me again. Why did you bother coming? Elryan saw red and suddenly punched out at Lionel, his fist carrying the weight of worlds. He had completely forgotten to hold back. Chapter 2239. Published at 16th of October 2023 11:59 and 48 seconds AM. Chapter 2239, Dream Step. Dream Shock. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2239 Dream Step. Dream Shock. Lionel's expression was already cold, but it was even more calculating than that. He had already felt the twitch of the start of Elryan's action before he even moved with intention. Inwardly, he still found it amusing, but there was nothing amusing about the power of the fist approaching him right this moment. There was no facing it, the only option was to dodge. And luckily, he was ready to do so. His steps moved at the same moment Elryan did, his head tilting to the side, and his body narrowing from Elryan's perspective. For a long while, Lionel had thought about maybe learning a dedicated technique for his movement, thinking that it might help boost himself to an all-new level. But every time he entered a situation like this one, he realized why he never had. Calculating which step to take was far better than any movement technique he could learn from someone else. Let's call it Dream Step. His hair fluttered as the roaring beast that was Elryan's strike flashed by his cheek, leaving a searing heat on their surface, but when had he ever feared heat? Boom! Even in the depths of space, there seemed to be the boom of wind and the collapse of the sound barrier, but Lionel realized that it was far more devastating than that. It was more like reality itself, the fabric of space, the folds of reality, had collapsed. It was truly ridiculous that a 14-year-old had such power. What would he be like after finishing puberty? Lionel reached forward with 2 fingers and jabbed them into the Pluto youth's ribcage. The latter was so large compared to him that his fingers would easily fit through the gaps, but slipping through was one matter, actually piercing through this tough, grayish-blue skin was a different matter entirely. However, Lionel didn't plan on piercing Elryan's skin. He had been in the latter's body already. He knew that it was very similar to that of humans aside from some small difference. He had not one stomach, but 4 of them. He had not one heart, but 2 of them. His muscle fibers made what Lionel was proud of seem like more of a joke than anything else. But the liver was still the liver. Spear force raged to life on the tips of his fingers, growing pointed and flashing with a bright gold. Bang! Lionel's 2 fingers pierced into the right side of Elryan's body, his timing perfect. Elryan was slow to react, having regretted his punch the moment he threw it out. That was when he felt a sudden jarring pain. At first, he hadn't felt that it was anything, he only wanted to let Lionel hit him out of apology, or that was what he told himself. He didn't know if he could dodge even if he had tried his very best. But right then, his nerves seemed to have been fried, and his entire body shut down. He shuddered and fell to a knee. He would have even fallen to the planets below if not for Lionel grabbing onto his shoulder with a palm, squeezing down. Even with him kneeling like this, he was still much taller than Lionel, and the latter had to reach up to grip him. Even so, he suddenly felt very small, and somewhat embarrassed. He looked down like a child that had done something wrong, and for the first time, Lionel felt that this behemoth actually looked like he was 14 years old. N-0-1 and Lionel actually felt somewhat bad for a moment. In truth, he had cheated as well. In the last moment, he realized that his strength wouldn't be enough to pierce Elryan's defenses, so he had added something unexpected to his spear force. Dream Force. His spear domain lineage factor was perfectly designed to accept the power of other forces. That was maybe its foundational strength. So, it had happened seamlessly. He used his dream force to amplify the feedback Elryan felt from his strike, amplifying a dull quake into a flood. He had never been able to emit his dream force in the past, but now that he had his emulation spatial force innate note, not to mention his domains, it was no longer that difficult for him. He had gotten much more used to the feeling after assimilating Lionel as well, though that power had already faded. Elryan's body had shut down, but it was just a trick of the mind, one that he would have probably shrugged off quite easily if he wasn't a child who felt that he was in the wrong. Lionel let Elryan rise after the latter had recovered. 2 new abilities in just a short few seconds, not bad. I should spend more time on my ability index. Let's call this one Dream Shock. Better? Lionel asked. Elryan didn't respond. He felt bad, but that didn't mean he had stopped thinking that Lionel was a bit of an asshole. That said, he realized that this man was doing this on purpose, and getting frustrated was only playing into his hands. This time, he would truly take his time to calm down. He was a Pluto, he couldn't keep allowing this to happen. Lionel smiled, but he didn't say anything. An agitated Pluto wasn't a useful Pluto. How would he make use of him if he was a loose cannon? Things were much better like this. At that moment, a starship suddenly flashed from the distance, coming out from a spatial tunnel. The markers of shield cross stars rose to the skies, and those familiar cool uniforms were lined across the bow of the ship. Lionel's senses pierced by them and into the ship, finding several barriers. But with the release of his dream domain, seeing through those barriers was as easy as breathing. He froze. Initially, he didn't care very much. There were just a large number of prisoners, likely being taken to those factories down below. However, deep within, he saw a man chained up, wearing broken silver armor that was all too familiar with. Then Elryan's words flashed in his mind. Aina? Lionel vanished before Elryan could react. Chapter 2240. Published at 16th of October 2023 11:59 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 2240. Crushed slowly. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2240. Crushed slowly. Lionel didn't spare the time to think about what relation shield cross stars might have to this matter, nor did he think about how this might be tied to the timeless event. His body moved on its own, and his speed was blazing. Why should he be surprised? It was a deduction he felt was obvious, even though he had never thought about it too clearly, especially after he had decided to crush the human domain. After he had thwarted the plan of God and the bishop, then continued to do so once again in the Camelot zone, he had offended a mysterious organization. Then, not long afterward, shield cross stars targeted him, leading him to become a fugitive. NOV, could there even be such a coincidence in this world? He could feel his mage core rip force from the surroundings, forcing the spatial force to bow in obedience as he crossed into the flying space of the starship instantly. Those of shield cross stars didn't expect to suddenly be attacked like this. Their flags were flying high, and who of the human domain didn't know of their standing? Such a standing had only solidified further after they had crushed the Silver Empire beneath their boots. Who still dared to attack them? Spatial force user. Deploy the barriers. Cross Elder Avon had yet to be born yet, maybe even his grandfather hadn't even been born yet. This current mission was being led by a certain Cross Elder Crystal, a woman built like a behemoth, standing with hulking shoulders and an even fiercer face. The way the patented metallic skirt of shield cross stars swayed between her legs beneath the forceful nature of her force made it seem as though it was made of silk rather than metal. She spotted Lionel with a sharp gaze. Although she could tell that Lionel was only in the 7th dimension, she felt that something was off about this matter. While it was possible that he was a straggling member of the Silver Empire taking a long shot at revenge, having lost his head to fury, anyone who knew Cross Elder Crystal knew that she did everything by the book. Even though she could crush a seventh-dimensional expert with a single look, she still forced them to deploy the shield, solidifying the spatial force in the region and ripping away what she thought was Lionel's greatest advantage. But soon enough, she realized that her caution actually wasn't enough. At that moment, the pull of Lionel's mage core surged and shredded the barriers apart. The restrictions that had once been able to hold him in place were torn apart, fueling his spatial force further and allowing him to jump forward even faster. Cross Elder Crystal's eyes narrowed. The defensive barrier was already up, so one could say that by deploying a spatial lock she was doing far more than was necessary. This wasn't a Tier 2 starship like the ones in Lionel's possession, this was a tried and true Tier 1 starship. Its power wasn't just a small bit greater, and its size was at least that of 10 planets. Ready the cannons. Another crew might have questioned why their commander was taking things so seriously, but this group had long since learned that questioning Crystal was a quick path to death. They aimed the cannons that could kill even overlords with a single stroke toward the swiftly approaching seventh-dimensional expert, already ready to fire. Fire. Lionel vanished. He appeared before the defensive barrier, his hands stretching out. Under the astonished gazes of the crew and the almighty Cross Elder, the barrier crumbled beneath Lionel's palm as though it was nothing more than ash in the wind. Lionel's current craftsmanship was on a level even life-grade crafters couldn't fathom. If he still allowed this sort of barrier to stop him, creating as the peak technology of a race not even capable of being at the peak of an incomplete world, what breakthroughs he had made would only be worthless. With a step, Lionel crossed the shattered motes of light, a sort of deathly beauty surrounding him as his spear appeared in his hands and his third-tier armor surrounded him. Morales? Cross Elder Crystal barked. State your name. How dare the Morales interfere in the matters of Shield Cross Stars? Lionel's abilities weren't exactly like she remembered the Morales to be, and she had also never seen a Morales without dark hair and eyes, but it was also hard to deny what she was seeing before her. She instantly decided to probe to see if she was correct about her assumption, but all she got in return was a blade. No, it wasn't a blade. It was a raging tornado of swirling spear force. Cross Elder Crystal went pale. When had the Morales produced a spearman with this level of skill? She didn't even realize that she had already forgotten that Lionel was only in the 7th dimension. The spear force didn't even touch her, but the instant it vanished, her subordinates fell to the deck one after another, and Lionel had already crossed by her, vanishing into the ship. She was violently shaken awake. Alert. Lionel, who had already entered the ship, found that all the high lights were turned off, replaced by flashing, deep rouge warning lights, supplemented by a blaring sound that made the ears want to scream. To his back, he sensed an oppressive aura pressing down on him. His spatial force felt more useless in this place than anywhere else. The best barrier was dense force of all kinds, it made it unstable to teleport anywhere, and unfortunately, the walls of this starship were flooded with force pouring in from the core. Lionel could only run the normal way, and obviously, he couldn't outpace an ancestor. But he could outsmart one. His gaze flickered with a dense cold light as his stance shifted, dodging out of the way of a strike coming from his back and cutting a corner. He understood this ship like the back of his hand, and he had a feeling that even this Cross Elder wasn't intimately familiar with this maze-like ship. At the same time, this ancestor couldn't attack with her full force for fear of injuring her companions. He would crush her slowly. Chapter 2241. Published at 16th of October 2023 11:59 and 44 seconds AM. Chapter 2241. Not enough. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2241. Not enough. Lionel moved like lightning, his agility hitting a completely different level. Every time he came across a Shield Cross Star member, he slaughtered them without mercy. N-OV/EL B/I, and although he didn't think about it much, it was almost amusing how difficult it used to be for him to kill. But he felt like he was a boulder one had rolled up from the bottom of a steep mountain. He reached the other side now and was tumbling with such speed that it was hard to tell what would happen when he got down to the bottom. Would he smoothly roll out and crush everything in his path? Or would he smash himself into countless little pieces? Lionel turned another corner, but this time his fist flashed, coated with a beautiful gold, black armor. Death force erupted from in a raging steam. It didn't seem to want to form into something solid, preferring to be an amorphous fog akin to dark force, but Lionel's mage core compressed it down, forcing it into a gauntlet that smashed through. A rush of pressure came gushing out. Screams filled the room as a dense heat and a leak of the fusion core spilled boiling energy into the region. Lionel seemed entirely unaffected. Could this fusion core's energy be hotter than the innate nodes that burned in his kidneys? Hot star force? Was there a hotter star force than scarlet star force? Without even turning back, the energy was pulled under his control, forming a curtain that Crystal braced herself to storm through. Her speed picked up, her hair singed and her fury bellowing as loudly as the hissing steam. She couldn't understand how a mere Tier 1 could blast a hole through the walls of this ship at such a critical point. How could channels carrying such hot fusion core energy not be heavily reinforced? But Lionel had burst through them so easily that she hadn't even been able to catch up after he slowed. Watching her subordinates die one after another, her blood threatened to boil over. The frustration of not being able to unleash her full strength for fear that she might cause more damage felt like she had been wrapped in plastic, her nose and mouth and all. She couldn't even run with her full force because her legs would blast through the floors, destroying whatever was below. The other Cross Elders had told her many times that she had to learn to be more delicate, but she had never expected that it would come back to bite her like this. She roared out in frustration as she turned a corner. As though a dragon, a line of force shot out from her lips, aiming for Lionel's back. Earth force? Lionel sneered inwardly. Trying to use earth force as though it was fire force is amusing enough. Trying to use it against me, though, when you haven't stepped into the impetus stage despite being an ancestor is even more amusing. The breath of force split around Lionel's body, being ripped from the Cross Elder's control. Lionel turned back as he continued to glide forward, his steps just as light. He raised his fists, the Cross Elder's 8th dimension-backed force pulling into gauntlets on his fist. He could feel their rage, shaking and quaking as he struggled to control them. In the end, an ancestor's full strength was still beyond him. But this wasn't her full strength. He inhaled a breath and his spear force surged before he punched out twice. He turned around and continued to rush forward, not even looking back. Crystal's expression changed once again, feeling a slight sense of danger. In the back of her mind, another question rose. Just how had Lionel used spear force with a punch? She had seen other masters use 2 fingers before, but that was still with the intention to treat their arm as a spear. But Lionel clearly hadn't had that intention, he had been thinking about punching all the while. Doing that should have caused his spear force to scatter. This boy is dangerous. Bang! Cross Elder Crystal stumbled back a strong step. The ground beneath her crumpled slightly as though it was aluminum foil. Her palms stretched out as she caught her own attack. She thought that she could deal with it easily as it was her own force added with a mere 7th-dimensional expert's force. But the spike of pain was immediate. She retrieved her palms after the force had vanished, looking down to see a spiral of blood trickling down her hands. She was astonished. A 7th-dimensional brat had injured her? Crystal realized at that moment that this matter was far more serious than she knew. If she kept holding back, then she would have to stand here and watch as every Shield Cross Stars member on board died. Even if some died beneath her rampage, they would just have to be sacrificed. Lionel sensed the towering aura behind erupt moments later, but a smile spread across his face. It seems that she's quite smart and cruel, at that. Unfortunately. Lionel's figure flickered to the side. Dream step. He slid by Crystal's blow by a hair, her fist gliding just over his shoulder and by his cheek. In fact, if all he did was shift to the side, her equally as monstrously sized chest would slam into his back. But that was exactly what he wanted. Star fusion, combustion. Boom! An eruption of red force flooded out of Lionel's body, his strength increasing so explosively that his bones cracked and his skin splintered. His hands reached up, and he grabbed Crystal's elbow with two strong hands. The Cross Elder's eyes opened wide, but Lionel had already dropped his hips, twisting his core and powering through his legs with his greatest might. Flares of foggy crimson force billow out from his armor as he roared. Crystal flipped over his shoulder, arms flailing as she tried to fly to change her momentum. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough. She flew right into the fusion core, blazing with energy. Boom! Chapter 2242. Published at 16th of October 2023 11:59 and 43 seconds AM. Chapter 2242. Danger if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 2242. Danger. Lionel raised up his hand, his mage core flaring as he roared. If he left things like this, then he and everyone else on this ship would die. Throwing someone into the fusion core wasn't enough to set it off. It was designed to be far more stable than that, and the entire ship was built around this design. However, a rampaging ancestor trying to save her own life was a completely different matter entirely. But he was prepared. The moment he had scanned through the ship, he had already been ready to deal with this particular outcome, as he had already deduced that this would be the easiest method he could use to deal with an ancestor. While it was true that he had improved greatly, it wasn't enough to close this sort of gap. He could now read and react to ancestors, but if he wanted to deal a death blow to them, he could only rely on this sort of method. His dream force flourished, rushing into the channels of force arts that maintained the fusion core and solidifying them. He roared as he poured 90% of his force into the closest lines and then began modifying those on the outside, morphing their structures and forcing them into more and more powerful states. The explosion was suddenly contained. Heat blasted into Lionel's body, threatening to rip him to pieces. But once again, this was what he feared the least. A wide grin spread across his face. He had gained a Tier 1 starship so cheaply. He had already improved enough to modify the Tier 2 starship, but now this would be yet another boon. He really wanted to see who would be able to stand up to his fleet of improved starships. He could see Crystal's face as she continued to struggle. Her armor had already melted, pouring over her skin and melding into her bone. Her limbs had vanished as she focused all of her force into the most important organs of her body and her head, and this woman actually continued to roar. If nothing else, she was a fighter. Your soul will do me nicely. Boom! Crystal vanished, burned to ash, and the fusion core collapsing under her might, only to be reined in by Lionel's own. The starship rumbled and dimmed, its power constructs fading as the channels were interrupted. It tipped over, but it continued to stay in the skies. The real problem was that without its protective force fields, its effect on gravity was immense, and instead of it falling toward the planets, it was instead the planets that began to be pulled toward it. Lionel's gaze flickered. He had been forced to disrupt the channels so that he could stabilize the core. He knew this would happen, but one problem at a time, right? N-OV/EL B/I, and he had to re-establish the channels, and that would take time. By then, the planets below would be ripped out of their usual alignment. Although he was confident in succeeding before they came crashing into the ship, it would still be too late to save the original balance. Unless... At that moment, a familiar gray-blue-skinned little boy god appeared in his senses, raiding the hourglass and freezing the planets in place. Lionel's lip curled and he got to work. It took him a few hours, much more than he had thought it would. But that was the thing with destroying things, it was far faster to do so than it was to build them back up. After he was done, he rushed out, still slaughtering all of the Shield Cross Star members that he came across. They weren't innocents, they were shoulders, and he didn't have the room nor the care to take prisoners. He appeared before a particular door and saw Aina, or rather the Emperor, within. She didn't seem to notice that he was there until he opened the gates. When she saw Lionel, her reaction wasn't as Lionel had expected at all. Aina opened her mouth to say something, but then she hesitated, forcing herself to calm down. She didn't know what kind of state Lionel was in, but the last time she had seen him, well, it was safe to say that their usual banter wouldn't fly. Aina bracing her, holding her tongue. I think I need to document this momentous occasion, Lionel said, nodding to himself as though seeing something spectacular. Aina was caught off guard and then suddenly furious. What are you trying to say? Am I a woman who doesn't understand propriety? Lionel coughed. Well, let's just say I only dared to say as much because you're in chains. There's really no better time, no? Aina glared at him, one part relieved, another part feeling that this change was far too easy, and yet another part feeling like ripping his face apart. You absolute idiot, do I look like the type of person who gets caught so easily? In this body, I could have ripped that foul woman apart 10 times over. I'm doing something important and you just went and ruined it. Lionel smiled. He had guessed this the moment he saw Aina's expression after noticing him, but he didn't feel too bad about it because what was done, at least in this case, anyway. Also, he could tell that her frustration didn't really come from him either. It was likely that upon her capture, she had suffered quite a lot, but she had forced herself to hold back her usually violent temper. That straight-laced ancestor he had just killed would have definitely made her life a living hell. She was probably looking forward to turning things on their head, but then he had appeared. Then what's your original plan? Lionel asked. I have a helpful little boy outside, it might make things easier on us. Little boy? Aina asked. Listening to her speak in such a rough and deep voice, when he had grown used to that sonorous, siren-like melody of a voice, was far easier than Lionel had accepted. It was as though the moment he realized this was Aina, he fell in love again. Of course. He would never tell his boys that he was looking upon a middle-aged man with such fondness in his eyes. He'd have to take that one to the grave. Forget it, this matter is bigger than you know. I don't know why you're in your original body, but if you only have 7th dimensional strength, you're in danger. Chapter 2243. Published at 16th of October 2023 11:59 and 42 seconds AM. Chapter 2243. Shredded to pieces. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2243. Shredded to pieces. Lionel's gaze flashed. I just killed an ancestor, you know, this lack of belief is hurtful. Aina rolled her eyes. Even in that body, it seemed that she oozed feminine charm. It was funny watching a middle-aged man act like this. He would probably be mortified if he were anywhere in there. He had spent all of his life being a dignified emperor, only for this to happen. Poor guy. I don't have many details, but I know that someone was waiting and expecting all of this to happen. More than half of the Silver Empire's galaxies were wiped out in an instant, and our fighting force was crushed. Even those that survived were suddenly ripped apart by the wild shift in gravity. I barely managed to hold on to the capital as it was. You know this, I entered the Silver Empire's zone before and I got a technique out of it. It's the technique that allowed me to assimilate with real demon blood and create my own demonic form. For whatever reason, these people are very interested in this technique and are doing whatever they can to get their hands on it. I was originally in a battle with them before Shield Cross Stars came on official business, and they vanished. You don't know who they are? Lionel asked. I can't be certain but they felt a lot like the people we met in the Cataclysm Zone, but more mature and stronger. Their foundations were incredibly solid, and their force manipulation, as you called it, was off the charts. Luckily, the Silver Emperor's body was incredibly powerful too. Lionel frowned. He felt confused, like countless stories were piling together in a manner that didn't quite make sense to him, and he still didn't understand how this matter might be related to the timeless event. According to his understanding, the Dream Project couldn't be created by the Cataclysm Zone's families and pavilions on their own. Instead, they relied on a favor the Plutos owed to the Fox, gaining the incomplete worlds, and then using it for their experimentation. There was likely some point in that timeline where they stabbed the Fox family in the back, and Earth became his grandfather's contingency plan, or maybe it was his plan all along, he wasn't certain. The likely purpose of the Dream Project was to strengthen the Cataclysm Zone so they could deal with an upcoming threat, likely demons that were adjacent to their world. As such, it made sense that they might send people in to steal a technique capable of allowing them to assimilate with demons. This wasn't what confused Lionel. He wanted to know how these matters were woven into one another and how they might come back to tie into the timeless event. He felt like he was missing just one kernel that might weave all of these things together. Were they wrapped in black chains and golden runes? Lionel asked. Aina, who was about to continue, stopped. How'd you know? She hadn't been there to witness the death of Lionel's father, so she didn't know how Lionel could possibly know these things. But yes, it was true that they had looked like that. I've seen them before, on that day, Lionel said lightly. Aina fell into silence. She knew what Lionel was talking about before he even explained. She wanted to comfort him, but he spoke before that. Continue. I realized immediately that there was something wrong with the appearance of shield cross stars. Their appearance was too timely. Wouldn't they want to deal with the Silver Empire too? Lionel asked. According to the history of the human domain, the Silver Empire was always a scourge. They were just too powerful to deal with immediately, so they were tolerated. Of course, this all wrapped back to the fact that they were demons. I would have thought so too, but I've learned a lot, speaking and questioning attendants and such. I assumed that all of this was related to the zone, which was why I was following it all to the end. According to my understanding, everything in the human domain has been peaceful for a long while. Everyone accepted the Silver Empire's demon status as something that was just part of their power. Lionel nodded slowly. Indeed, it had always sounded like an excuse to him. The Morales and the Suyard both had clearly demonic characters in their lineage factors, so why weren't they treated the same? Something didn't add up. It seems that no one turned on the Silver Empire until they were suddenly greatly weakened, and then they swooped in. If what you're saying is correct, it's even odder. Those people who were capable of battling your father should be supremely powerful. There's no reason for them to fear the appearance of shield cross stars unless there was another reason. The pieces were slowly coming together, becoming clearer in Lionel's mind. Of course, he had been naive. If the four great families could target the Fox family, destroying them, even though the latter was the reason they had a chance at all to grow powerful, then who was to say that there wasn't more internal strife in the Cataclysm Zone complete world? Even further than just that, they had the tablets that could grant them the Northern Star lineage factor, and on top of that, somehow, in the past, the Fox family had been strong enough to have the Pluto race owe them a favor. How else could they have been that strong if not by the most obvious answer? It all lined up slowly. Those henchmen of the god beast of destruction had yet to vanish from the world. They were still making their presence known, and they were trying to sink their claws into one of the few remaining human bubbles. It was almost obvious. After such a war, how could there be many humans left if even the god beasts had practically gone extinct? Any that remained would be first on the chopping block. They were probably being ripped apart by the sheer number of forces trying to take control of them. N/O-V/EL B/I/N. At that moment, it happened. The veil that Elryan had put upon the planets in order to keep them in alignment was shredded to pieces. Lionel's gaze sharpened. Chapter 2244. Published at 16th of October 2023 11:59 and 24 seconds AM. Chapter 2244. Horizon. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2244. Horizon. Lionel stomped, disrupting the force arts beneath him and releasing the shackles that had bound Aina. Her expression couldn't help but change. It definitely shouldn't have been so simple. She might not be a crafter, but she had some understanding of the profession, and though she knew Lionel was excellent, he hadn't reached the point of being able to ignore everything, or else it wouldn't have been so difficult for him to deal with the starship of the Omen family. But now, it felt like he looked at this level of craftsmanship as though it was child's play. It had only been less than a day since the last time she saw him. Her expression flickered with a hint of a complex emotion. Lionel's greatest fear in the past was that his compassion would vanish and his truest self would be unveiled, causing him to disregard the lives of the people he had once wanted to become a king in order to protect. However, the fears of everyone else should have been very different. If the Lionel of the past was gone, and he spent every day, seriously plotting to improve himself toward a goal, then just what would he accomplish? She had always been a hard worker, but Lionel always seemed to keep up with her steps effortlessly. This wasn't something that she had ever told him about, but it left her feeling a bit uncomfortable, not because she was jealous, but because she felt that he might very well leave her behind one day. It was an odd emotion for her, especially since the reason she trained so hard wasn't for the sake of keeping up with Lionel, but rather to gain revenge for her mother. The fact she had such thoughts left her feeling guilty on two fronts, one being that of Lionel and her hope that he would slow down somewhat, and the second being that of her mother who she felt should be her sole focus. These were things that she could never bring herself to speak about with Lionel because she felt that they were just as ridiculous as the thoughts that had caused her to leave him in the first place, a decision she still regretted to this day. Also, what kind of girlfriend would she be pouring her problems onto Lionel when it was he who needed support now and not him? In all of her swirl of emotions, triggered by a simple action of Lionel's, she shook when Lionel suddenly vanished. She saw that smirk on his face and snorted. Lionel appeared on the outside of the starship with great speed, however when he got there, he found the back of a broken silver armor. His lip couldn't help but twitch. "You're slow," Aina said lightly, hiding away her grin with her broad shoulders and back. Lionel opened his mouth to respond, but he closed it. Aina snickered, loving every minute, but soon neither of them could focus on their banter at all because what was happening below seemed to be nothing. They frowned. Aina obviously didn't know who Elryan was just yet, but she had sensed it as well. There had just been a large and sturdy barrier, but it had vanished. No, it had been unceremoniously shattered by an overwhelming strength. So who had done it? Where had it gone? Aina's first instinct was the large gray-blue man who made her heart skip a beat, radiating a danger that put her on guard. But when she saw that Lionel didn't mind him, she knew that there was something deeper going on here, and it had nothing to do with this man. "You know him?" Aina asked. "Ah, the little boy, yeah, he's all right, I guess." "Little?" "Don't say that with so much shock, you'll make me think I'm lacking something," Lionel pouted. Aina rolled her eyes. Was it just her or had this man become more insufferable? How he could still flirt with her when she was in this body was beyond her, but it also somewhat warmed her heart. "I didn't think you'd be so flirty. Is there something you want to tell me?" Lionel placed a hand to his chest. "If this is your way of asking me if I want to introduce a third to our bedroom, I'll have to reject, thank you." "I'm not a fan of Sharon Dash." A kick landed on Lionel's chest, sending him flying back into the flagship. Elryan caught this matter in his periphery, and he really wanted to be happy about it. But, it was coming. "Can't you choose your words more carefully?" Aina put her hands on her hip, another amusing sight. If someone else had said something like that, you would have probably put their head on a pike. Lionel coughed between his laughter. She wasn't wrong, but that only made it funnier. Boom! Lionel's eyes widened. His internal sight hadn't caught onto what was happening at all. It just suddenly appeared, a hand the size of a planet, extending out from one of the many factories beneath. He realized that it wasn't that he had been neglectful, but rather the very same protections that the Raypax had against his senses. He deployed his dream domain instantly, but to his shock, even this was useless. Even the Raypax couldn't hide from the deployment of his dream world, but then he remembered. His lineage factor had changed. How could he still deploy his dream world at all? He no longer had the 3 domains of the starry-tailed fox. His perception changed and the way he used his dream world changed once again. But he realized that even then, it was still useless. All of this happened in an instant, even as he was rushing to his feet. When he laid his eyes on it, his heart grew stone cold. It wasn't a hand at all, it was a shadow that seemed to cover the skies to infinity, reaching up like it had no limits and appearing before El Ryan in an instant. The Pluto was set flying back, his still injured chest caving in even further as he flashed so far into the distance he looked like one of the many stars on the horizon. N0 VL1 and Lionel was certain. One of the god-beast of destruction's henchmen, the Shadow Tail, had appeared. Chapter 2245. Published at 17th of October 2023 11:40 and 44 seconds AM. Chapter 2245. Damned woman, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2245. Damned woman. Lionel's pupils constricted into pinholes. Aina! He roared. Up until this point, aside from his father, El Ryan was simply the strongest person he had ever come across. Although he had been injured by the entity and only had a fraction of his peak strength remaining, he had attacked that very same man with the full brunt of his modified starship and hadn't even managed to cut his wrist off completely, what should have supposedly been one of the weakest parts of his body. But now, that very same El Ryan, while holding his family's strongest treasure at that, was blown away as though a leaf in the wind. The strength of this monstrous creature wasn't something that he could fathom. And the most horrible part was that even after he had attacked, the regulator showed no intention of taking action. Aina had already acted. In fact, she was happy that she had sent Lionel flying into the starship as well, because even though she was shaking in fear currently, she couldn't imagine what would happen to Lionel if he was struck like that. Lionel stood in a fury, but Aina was already attacking. NOV/E/1. BI/N. Damned woman, how D. Lionel caught him, surprised by what he had been about to say, but that didn't calm his rage at all. He was far too furious to think about it with much depth, his thoughts were entirely occupied with how to get out of this situation. But that only lasted a second before the rage spilled over once again. Why didn't she listen to him? There was clearly a huge gap between them, a gap that couldn't be closed with her style of battle. The smart thing would be to rely on his style of battle instead. No matter how much she hated it, it was clear and obvious that his more devious, long game, calculation-intensive approach to battle was the far better approach here. And yet, she had just stormed in as though he needed to be protected to her back. It was cute, funny even when they were in normal settings and he allowed her to take the lead. It was light-hearted, and he didn't mind because he was confident in himself not to care. He loved her, and that was enough for him to allow her to do as she pleased in 99% of situations. But in this 1%, in these dangerous situations, in times where their lives were on the line, she had to listen to him. She had to let him stand in front of her, no matter what she perceived her strength to be. Lionel dashed forward at his greatest possible speed. The appearance of the Shadow Tail and the destruction of the barrier of time and space had been far too volatile and violent, causing his spatial force to be useless. He ran forward even though he knew it was foolish, even though he knew it would change nothing. His best weapon was the ship he had just been in. Even his modified ships were at least 20% weaker than a true Tier 1 starship, and yet he ignored it all. But he was far too slow. Without the use of external force, he was just a Tier 1 of the 7th dimension. He wasn't a member of the god races, he wasn't even one of the many races just a step below, he was a human, he was weak. Aina punched out with the full strength that she could muster. All of her previous injuries seemed to have vanished, but they had only been that facades she used to let the members of S.H.I.E.L.D. cross stars think that they had been able to catch her. In reality, she had already long since surpassed the former Silver Emperor, and not just by a small margin at that. It gave her confidence. Confidence that vanished in the face of this beast. But she had to stand before it. She gave her everything, throwing out a strike that was the greatest of her life. It was far too similar. A strike that gave everything to protect the person they cared so much for to their back. Lionel's gaze turned a furious shade of red, trying to tap into a power hidden deep within him. But then he saw a smile. It was just a pair of cherry lips, graceful and beautiful, enticing and soft, so gorgeous it could make a man forget everything in his life to worship at the feet of its owner. He only saw it for a brief moment, and then the power that he couldn't even control, power he wasn't confident in pulling out of himself in the first place, vanished like a puff of wind. It was as though that smile was teasing him, holding a piece of meat right in front of his face. It was insulting, patronizing, the lowest form of instigation. And it worked. Ana's fist landed, and an overwhelming force swallowed her up. Lionel couldn't spot anything but a mist of blood. Bits and pieces of something shattered, sent flying so far into the distance, and at such a fast speed, he didn't even have the time to catch her. Dead? Dead again? Another one? So quickly? He had just. Lionel roared, his fury rising like an overwhelming tide. I'll kill you. I swear I'll kill you. I'll shred apart everything you care for. I'll grind your pride into the dirt and make you face that sick smile. It didn't matter how loud he roared, how violently his blood boiled, that same overwhelming power didn't come. That smile didn't even appear again. It was as though it couldn't be bothered to stick around to listen to the tantrum of a child. She had already seen the amusing expression she had wanted to see. She was bored now and wanted to entertain herself with something else. However, none of this stopped Lionel's furious bellow. What did was the shadow tail suddenly turning on him, curving through the air as though it didn't have a form and smashing toward him. Chapter 2246. Published at 17th of October 2023 11:40 and 43 seconds AM. Chapter 2246. Fear. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2246. Fear. Lionel watched the shadow tail come toward him, his body and his very soul seething. The veins in his eyes popped and seemed to roar all on their own, breaking and pulsing. They shattered, blood leaking from his eyes and splitting over. However, just as quickly as they appeared, they erupted into a burning flame. Streaks of fire ran down his cheeks as he watched the shadow tail get closer and closer, but he didn't move, he didn't even seem to react at all. The flames dripped down his body, blazing with greater and greater fervor. She called me a destruction sovereign, Lionel suddenly said, as though he was speaking to the shadow tail that approached him. In the vastness of space, their distance between one another couldn't even be described in simple kilometers and miles any longer, and yet it crossed this seemingly impossible distance with such speed that it only seemed normal that Lionel couldn't react. She said I shouldn't exist, that she felt the need to kill me for that. Is that what your people told her? Did you use a similar reason to target my father? Was he too great a threat to you? A variable you couldn't deal with? So much so that you had to use a coward's path to deal with him? Couldn't even face him yourself? Too scared to fall to a single spear strike. The shadow tail was moving even faster, the distance closing with such speed that it was already upon Lionel. It didn't even seem to respond, as though it never understood his words. But Lionel continued speaking as though it didn't matter to him one way or another. Is that all you mighty races are worth? All the backbone you have? Are you that easily scared? Lionel looked up, his gaze no longer even seemed to be a gaze, it was rather two blazing balls of red gold flames, flickering with the brightness of a twin pair of stars. In that case, I'll give you something to truly fear. Remember this promise, you and the rest of your kind. I, Lionel Morales, will not rest until every single last one of you is wiped from existence. Do you think I need this power? Do you think it matters if I don't have a fraction of your strength? No, B. In the blazing fires in Lionel's eyes seemed to catch the surface of the shadow tail, but they did absolutely nothing. They might as well have been a pair of gently blowing winds, gliding across its tough, black skin. The raging heat was worthless before its might. However, as insignificant as they were, the fires continued to flicker weakly as though in sheer defiance as Lionel spoke one last time. I swear that I will do these things, and I will do so as a human. That power, he would never use it again. Not until he crushed that smile beneath his feet, not until she understood with or without it, she wasn't worthy of mocking him. No one was. Not even this shadow tail. Not even while he was merely in the seventh dimension. Not even when a Pluto could do nothing before its might. Still within the range of the starship, having not moved nearly fast enough to get out of its way, Lionel suddenly stretched his dream force out, solidifying his dream world once more, but not to observe this shadow tail. Instead, he activated the defensive formation once again. Bang! The shadow tail shot through it as though it was nothing but a thin pane of glass. It was so swift that if not for the shattered motes of force, it would have been impossible to tell that there had been a barrier up at all. However, Lionel didn't even seem to care. In fact, Lionel wasn't standing in the same spot at all, he had already moved. He had deployed the barrier not to stop this monster before him, but rather as a stabilizing force. He used the power of the starship to still the raging force in the surroundings and allow him to use his spatial force once again. He appeared a long distance away, deep within the range of the starship and hovering over its body. His gaze only seemed to grow colder and colder despite the raging flames only becoming hotter and hotter. Veins of red tore across his skin and the space around him cracked and fractured, collapsing and fissuring. Boom! The shadow tail tore through the Tier 1 starship as though it was papier-mâché. The strongest weapon of the human domain was worthless before it, a piece of tin-foil trash. It didn't matter what materials it was made out of, what could it do against an envoy of destruction? The ship was ripped to shreds, even the fusion core was absolutely useless, it flew through it as though it was nothing more than a slightly warm breeze, causing a deafening explosion that could be heard across the galaxy. It flung out so much matter that sound even traveled normally. Little lion. Lionel finally heard his mother's screech. He had already sensed her appearance, but her force couldn't reach so far, and the vacuum of space hadn't allowed her voice to travel. It was only then that he registered her voice for only a moment before it was overwhelmed by the boom. However, his only thoughts were simple. He was here. So why was she worried? Lionel stretched out his hands, the bits and pieces of the starship, or rather the force arts that had once formed them together into a single existence, responded to his call even as the shadow tail closed the distance once more. You will be the first. At that moment, the scattered pieces of debris, flying out in all directions, wildly and uncontrolled, froze into place under a mysterious power. They were linked, one after another in a pattern that would be oh so familiar to anyone who had completed the trial puzzle of the dimensional cleanse zone. The power of the destroyed fusion core flooded into the surroundings, pooling away, and much of it being pulled into Lionel's control under his Scarlet Star Force, strengthening the connection between the nodes. The world froze and then Lionel and the shadow tail vanished. Silence fell and a vast emptiness was left behind. Lionel didn't know how long he watched the scene. Watching the shadow tail writhe in pain and horror, being slowly torn apart by the collapsing world around them didn't move him. A godlike creature was being tortured beneath his schemes, beneath his own power, and yet he only felt that it was natural, a dense emptiness within his heart. He reached forward, grabbing its shredded body as it slowly breathed its last. It was enormous compared to his body. It was like an ant holding up a silverback gorilla, looking down at it like a hunting trophy. He could finally feel some emotion coming from it. It was palpable, hanging in the air like a thick curtain of heavy rain. Rage, fury, humiliation. Fear. Yes. Lionel spoke lightly. That's exactly what you should feel. It's what'll make every single last one of you feel. Chapter 2247. Published at 17th of October 2023 11:40 and 41 seconds AM. Chapter 2247. Stunned speechless. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2247. Stunned speechless. Lionel walked out from seemingly nowhere, a corpse as large as a moon, and only getting bigger, hanging from his silver, white gold arm. The shadow tail's body seemed to be losing its form slowly, or what small bit of form it had once had, the longer it spent dead. Its billowing dark force spread out, and as it did so, its large, mangled body expanded as though there was a balloon within it. He was so small compared to the corpse of the shadow tail that it was almost impossible to tell that the former was being carried at all. It seemed more like the beast was languid, beaten and battered with injuries, and it was only now slowly making its way back. As for Lionel, his gaze was vacant and empty. They held an unfathomable depth, one worn and torn by the ages. There was one person, though, who noticed him immediately. Alienor, or rather Alienor in the body of a woman he didn't recognize, rushed forward with her greatest speed. However, in the devastation, and especially after being blown so far back by the destruction of the fusion core, just how far was that distance? Who could stop a grieving mother, though? It had been hours since Lionel had disappeared, and Alienor had already pried herself forward, looking through the debris of the destroyed Tier 1 starship. When she saw the shadow tail suddenly appear, she rushed forward in a fury. But when she noticed its startling lack of a reaction, and then saw that it was actually being carried, her tears spilled forward in a torrent. She rushed forward and buried Lionel's head into her chest, holding onto him maybe more tightly than she should have. She seemed to have completely forgotten that to Lionel, she should have just been a random woman he had never met before, but she couldn't be bothered to deal with this. She didn't care how Lionel had defeated the Shadow Tail, she didn't care where he had gone, she didn't care about the zone or what challenges they had passed or failed, she just pulled in her son as tightly as she could, and Lionel let her do as he pleased. He stood there, silently listening to the sobs of his mother. After a long while, he spoke. "There's never a need to worry when I'm here. I promise." Alienor only cried harder when she heard this. These words, they were all too familiar. She had tried her best to not show Lionel her tears, to not show weakness, to be the same strong pillar that her husband had been, but the loss was weighing heavy on her, and just now she thought that she had lost even her son. She wasn't strong enough, not nearly strong enough. Her son shouldn't have to say such words to her, her husband shouldn't have had to say such words to her, she should have been able to stand in front of the former and stand beside the latter, and yet all she could do was hold them and cry. "I'm sorry, little lion, Mom is sorry." Lionel didn't say anything. He had already said all he needed to say. He might understand how his mother felt, or how Aina had felt, but soon, there would come a day where their hearts could lay to rest and their calm could return, a day when their confidence in him was just as high as his confidence in himself, and if not, then the day where there was no one left to threaten them would come first. Alienor pulled back, teary-faced, looking into the abyss of her son's eyes. She didn't seem surprised to see this. She had observed Lionel for far longer than he knew, at least until recently. She understood him better than most, which was exactly why she had never tried to coddle his feelings. But it was ironic. She said that she would be a true mother, and yet she had indulged her son instead of doing the opposite. It was embarrassing. She wasn't all that far from 100 years old, relatively speaking, but she still didn't quite understand how to be a parent. It was hard to accept. She had been talented all her life, and it could be said that she rarely came across any roadblocks, but this. She didn't quite know what to do. "I'll be back," Lionel said lightly before Alienor could make up her mind. He took a step and vanished into the distance. Alienor's shoulders trembled, but she bit her lip hard, so hard that blood dribbled down her chin. She didn't have a decision, but the one thing she knew was that her tears wouldn't fix anything. Lionel moved into the distance, crossing large distances. "Anastasia," Lionel said. Is the snow globe large enough to take this thing? You want to keep it? I can't leave it lying around just anywhere, and I feel like I might be able to use it to strengthen my lineage factors with." His voice trailed off. He wanted to say Aina's help, but his intention switched. If Aina's skill increased enough, she could definitely succeed. If he wanted to use it to form an armor, he didn't know if even his current self, with all the improvement he had made, was enough to process this envoy of destruction into a divine armor. It was a task so complex he couldn't wrap his mind around it, and he had yet to ever use living existences in his armor. He didn't even quite know if it was possible. "None of the current snow globes can contain it, but I can do something about that. N0-1N, thanks," Lionel said lightly. The corpse suddenly vanished from his hand, but not before a certain Pluto caught sight of it from the distance. Elryan's tongue felt both tied and frozen. That creature that had shaken him to his core was dead? It was dead? And by the hands of this human? No, the timeless event, it surely revolved around this creature, no? What did that mean for it, then? Just how? He was stunned, speechless. Chapter 2248. Published at 23rd of October 2023, 7:10 and 47 seconds AM. Chapter 2248. What good was it? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2248. What good was it? The Pluto race youth was in a sorry state. It was already odd seeing someone so heavily injured not bleed even a drop of blood, but that was maybe the constant state of the Pluto race. On the rare occasion that they were actually hurt, that is. What happened? Lionel walked by the Elryan, ignoring him. He could spare a few words for his mother, but Elryan wasn't such a person to him. In fact, if he could kill Elryan and take the hourglass, he would do so. Unfortunately, he would have to waste his best opportunity to get his hands on that item until he could figure out a method to take it away without it ripping his arm from his shoulder. Elryan's gaze flickered, but he didn't say anything. Lionel had already been in a bad state when he met him, but this. Lionel continued to walk. The further he got out of the range of the original battlefield, the further he could blink ahead. Eventually, he made it. In the depths of space, there was no wind, no resistance, and the forces in action were so weak that once something started flying in a certain direction, getting it to stop was just hoping that it crashed into a planet. But in the vastness of this emptiness, that was like hoping a sewing line would thread itself into a needle cast into the ocean off the back of a wave. There was too much darkness, too much emptiness. But that also meant that if something flew in a single direction, you would almost always find it continuing in that said direction, at the same speed, at the same pace. The first thing Lionel saw was red. A blob of rouge that surged through the skies, scattered like a smear of paint. There wasn't even the semblance of a body remaining, there was nothing body blood, even the flesh was minced so fine that it looked not much different. The fact there was anything at all remaining, though, was quite surprising. Lionel had begun his journey, thinking that he wouldn't find anything at all. Maybe he would walk in this direction to the ends of the universe and never find the remains of Aina. He felt his heart lurch as he stood there. He didn't even know why he had come, it was just as foolish as his actions had been previously. He knew that if he found anything, it would be exactly this, a spattering of blood, drawn across the endless darkness of space, a ghastly gore that even the twinkling stars in the distance couldn't seem to brighten. There was no breath, no life, nothing. And why would there be? There wasn't even a body to hold it. That rage that Lionel thought he had vented, watching the shadow tail writhe and squirm in its last moments, came back even more furious. They should have grown old together. They should have had a school of children. He should have crowned each one of them little princes and princesses, allowing them to live a life of freedom and leisure. He gripped his fists so hard that the small bones in his hands cracked one after another, his nails splintering, but he couldn't seem to feel it at all. He knew it was all useless. He had allowed Aina to separate her soul, the destruction of her body shouldn't have been the end of her, but how could such a blow not shatter any semblance of an ethereal glabella that she had? And even if it hadn't, this zone would have forced her soul to fuse with the body of the Silver Emperor. There was no telling if the benefits would still be the same. Without an ethereal glabella, her soul would have dissipated from her body even quicker. After he had spent hours battling the shadow tail, it was impossible that there would still be a soul here for him to awaken. He gripped his fists harder. The shadow tail was targeting everyone, it targeted him immediately after dealing with Aina. He didn't have the strength to ignore it and go after Aina immediately. He could only sit and wait for it to die, dancing on the edge of life and death until he could finally return. But he knew it was useless. Even if he had been able to go after Aina immediately, the speed of the blow was so great, and she was moving so fast, that by the time he finally caught up, her soul would have already dissipated. The only reason she had even slowed down enough for him to catch up at all was because her body had dispersed into countless pieces and the force was distributed across them. Ironically, the reason he could see her again, even in this case, was because she was nothing more than a mist of blood. Lionel closed his eyes, his heart threatening to beat out of his chest. Suddenly, his eyes opened wide. His actions seemed to be a step ahead of his thoughts as he opened a palm, a golden tablet appearing within. He had taken it out of Aina's room, or rather their room. Aina had stopped staying in her own room a long time ago. Something clicked for Lionel. He reached forward, his vital star force blazing to life, and it sparked like blue lightning, jumping from his finger and toward the first blob of blood. At the same time, his hand that held the tablet pulsed. N/0 Velb 1 NAS. Though a magnet, the globules of blood, connected by vital star force, roared to life and surged into the tablet. Lionel frowned. He had acted practically on instinct, as though his body wasn't his own. He knew that vital star force was the life force of the body, but what good was it if there was no soul or ethereal glabella? The root of one's life was one's soul force and dream force. He had seen many examples already of people living with their bodies destroyed but their souls intact. It didn't even make sense to him that the vice versa could happen. What did it mean to have a body without a soul? Wouldn't it just be an empty carcass? What good would it be to regain Aina's corpse? In fact, it might not even look like Aina. It would just be a middle-aged man's naked body. Chapter 2249. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:10 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 2249. A pair of sovereigns. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2249. A pair of sovereigns. Lionel's pupils constricted. The blood came together, forming a connection with the tablet, but what shocked him the most was the form it took. It was Aina, most definitely Aina. Although it was like a liquid mass of crimson, and it was a body formed entirely of blood without the slightest hint of flesh and bone, he would recognize that body anywhere. In fact, he recognized it even before the details of her face fully formed and strands of long, blood hairs took shape as well. However, after being shocked for a moment, Lionel closed his eyes and sighed. It still had no soul. He had gotten a foolish rush of hope just now when even someone from third-dimensional Earth would be able to understand what was going on. A single cell of the body carried all the DNA information one needed about a person. That sequence would be able to decide everything. It was probably possible from those of higher dimensional worlds to reform a body out of a single drop of blood, and even take some guesses as to what kind of personality the person in question might have had. Of course, this was possible in higher dimensional worlds, because it was possible even on modern Earth. It quite literally meant nothing that this blood was able to take the shape of Aina's real body. In fact, if a blood sovereign tablet wasn't capable of at least this much, then what worth would it have? How would it still dare to call itself such a thing? The only real oddity is that it managed to pull out Aina's body from within the Silver Emperor's body, a feat that Lionel had only seen the entity accomplish so easily, but even that made perfect sense. N-O/V//E-L-B-1-. And the human race was one connected to the god beasts of both creation and destruction. Lionel didn't believe that it was a coincidence that this golden tablet shared the same color as the Fox golden tablet, and most importantly, what he assumed would be the Northern Star lineage factor's two golden tablets. For them to share the same form as the Northern Star lineage factor, it wasn't too large of a leap to assume that all of the tablets originated from the god beasts. The humans were able to retain some of them even after the war, and for whatever reason, the other races hadn't targeted them for possession. Though, even that might not necessarily be true. From Lionel's understanding, the Cataclysm Zone was in great danger, and that was the reason for the existence of these simulation worlds in the first place. It could very well be that these tablets were precisely what their enemies were targeting. That would also explain why they had held such a competition when Lionel had been there and why they allowed the youths to trade for them. Though Lionel hadn't exactly traded for this golden tablet, he didn't gather nearly enough points. This was all to say that if there was a treasure that could accomplish what that entity had, then it was these very golden tablets. Even this wasn't too surprising. Lionel's gaze softened somewhat as he looked at the bloody mist that had formed into Aina. He felt a pressure on his chest increase before he pressed it down. It was exactly while he was focused on this that Aina's figure was sucked into the tablet. His heart skipped a beat and he pulled the tablet back hurriedly, but it was already too late. He felt a panic in his heart. He had no idea what this tablet wanted to do and his understanding of the blood sovereign path was far too limited. Even so, from his understanding, devouring blood was practically the baseline of how all of these abilities worked. What if that was exactly what this tablet wanted to do? But it was too late. He couldn't do anything as it rushed in, even ripping away a large portion of his vital star force and practically sucking his 3 vital stars out of his body. His body went limp and he stumbled in the air, almost falling over entirely. Beaten and haggard, he looked toward the tablet with a listless expression, unable to even see straight and proper any longer. And then everything fell into silence. There was no magical revival, no sudden change, no earth-shuddering, jaw-dropping transformations, there was just nothing. Lionel drifted in the emptiness, not saying anything. The despair on his face had already faded and he simply did nothing, thought nothing, not moving at all. He probably should have felt rage, and that he did, but he had already reached such a peak that it simply simmered and smoldered over the hot, ashy coals of his heart. He had reached such a depth of wrath and fury that it simply became nothing but a bright sheet of white, reflecting on his face as indifference and coldness. He didn't know how long passed, but he simply stood, placing the golden tablet back into his and Aina's room. He walked back slowly, not noticing the smoky blackness under the soles of his feet. When he turned, he realized that Elryan was still there. He seemed to be trying to keep a respectful distance. Not that that meant much when he could quite literally see for thousands of miles away as though it was all right before his face. Looking at the soles of Lionel's feet, and the smoky ash coming out from the sides of his eyes, Elryan paused. "You are a destruction sovereign?" Lionel didn't answer, he simply kept walking. Destruction sovereign? God beast of destruction? He wouldn't be surprised if they were related somehow and even less if Elryan tried to kill him for it. However, he was truly not in the mood. If the Pluto race wanted to lose a junior today, he would gladly oblige. She's a blood sovereign? Lionel, who had ignored Elryan to this point, looked toward him, his eyes carrying a smoldering sharpness. Elryan could even feel the heat on his own eyes. Had he not been a Pluto, his eyes would have already combusted. Then you can probably save her. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.